A very good morning and welcome to the 33rd meeting of the Criminal Justice Committee in 2025. We have no apologies this morning and Fulton McGregor is joining us online, and we're also joined this morning by Pam Gossell, MSP. So our first item of business in public today is to decide whether to consider all evidence heard and any follow-up correspondence or action from our consideration of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service delivery review in private at this meeting and at future meetings. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Our next item of business today is to begin our evidence taking on the Prevention of Domestic Abuse Scotland Bill. So we have one panel of witnesses today, and I intend to allow up to 90 minutes for this panel. And I refer members to papers 2, 3 and 4. So I welcome to the meeting Debbie Jupp, Operational Manager at Committed to Ending Abuse, Dr Marcia Scott, Chief Executive with Scottish Women's Aid, Agnes Tolmie, who's joining us online, Chair of the Scottish Women's Convention, and Tumi Forster, Operational Manager with Shakti Women's Aid. So a warm welcome to you all and thank you for your written submissions. So just before we start, can I remind everyone to please be as succinct as you can in your questions and answers. So I wonder if I can open up with a very broad opening question and then I'll bring in other members, and I'll maybe start off with Dr Marcia Scott, and then I'll bring in Tumi Forster, Agnes Tolmie and then Debbie Jupp. So hopefully we'll remember that order. So can I begin by asking you what your views are on the main provisions of the bill? So I'm particularly interested in parts 1 and 2, and what parts you particularly support and which parts you maybe disagree with or have some questions around. So, Dr Scott, Marcia, over to you.
Obviously, Scottish Women's Aid is delighted when any MSP is willing to go to the effort of bringing a bill to the Scottish Parliament to prevent domestic abuse. And we very warmly welcome the intentions of this bill. Unfortunately, we're concerned that it won't necessarily have the results that was intended, and it won't serve women and children particularly well, some of it. We are really supportive of the I think it's section 3, which is the data section. We're very, very concerned about the state of, despite whining for a decade now, about the failure of the justice organizations to collect equalities data and to disaggregate it. So we would really welcome any kind of statutory approach to although we have laws in place already with the public sector equality duty that really essentially require collection of and disaggregation of data, we've to date failed to see any progress really on that. Our concerns, I suppose, are that I spent a fair amount of time talking with Pam and also with colleagues in the other justice organizations, so police, the Crown, court service, and I'm concerned that the measures proposed are not really going to make a big difference for women and children, and certainly not for a significant number of them, but they will lay a particularly heavy bureaucratic burden on the organizations that are being asked to engage, and especially in terms of the use of MAPA structures, we're really concerned that, as we see happen all the time, is that resources will be moved from the non-statutory infrastructure like MARACs and which are already under-resourced and inconsistently, supported across Scotland. Because we see this with child protection, which I'm not saying here that we shouldn't have child protection on a statutory basis, but what I am saying is that at local resource, it trumps pretty much everything else. And what we're really concerned about is putting in a structure that will draw resources away from MARACs and multi-agency working, and especially for MAPA, which was never designed to work for domestic abuse. It's designed for sexual offending. So I think those are some of the top concerns that we have.
Okay, thank you very much. Toomey.
Morning. Sharkday Women's Aid supporting BME communities in Scotland is a specialist organisation in terms of providing domestic abuse. We do feel actually the proposal holds a lot of opportunity. However, we need to understand better how it will fit in with the existing structures. So we're talking about the MARACs, we're talking about the Caledonian programs, or again, in terms of the Equally Safe at Schools. So we just need to understand better how it will fit in, because obviously it's not about reinventing the wheel, but it's actually making sure that it fits in with what exists already. However, it is very promising that to put a lot of these things, for example, preventative work at schools or the rehabilitation programs in statute. So, because at the moment, although these exist, it varies, so you'll get a varying response. So, for example, if it's Equally Safe at Schools, you would get various schools following that, and some schools aren't. But when it's actually statute-backed, that will be a different story. So, and same with rehabilitation programs. For example, yes, of course, there's the Caledonian program, but which we know, for example, from BME perspective, is not very bespoke. Now, a lot of the domestic abuse behaviours we know, for example, for BME communities, are cultural and tradition-driven. Now, whether that is taken into consideration by the Caledonian programme is not very sure and certain. Now, whether this bill can actually move towards that, that would be very, very welcoming. Data collection for us is we fully support that, because anything that supports data on BME-specific abuse is very welcome, because at the moment, unfortunately, in Scotland today, we do not hold this data. And because we do not hold this data, then it becomes extremely difficult to actually, for any organisation, whether it be public organisation, statutory or third sector organisations, to actually say, this is the problem at hand. Because we do not have a data set where we can start from and we can build on. So even if we actually went to organisations like, statutory bodies like the Police Scotland, they will be able to give you a figure of how many cases, for example, in Domestic Abuse Scotland Act. But when you actually ask for a breakdown, that is not there. So we would very much welcome if Police Scotland, for example, were able to say to us, this is the number of HVA cases, this is the number of forced marriage cases, this is the number of transnational abandonment cases. That would be amazing, because if we're really aiming for a fully diverse and welcoming Scotland, we need to start at that level where statutory bodies are able to give us that data. And that simply is not there at the moment. So data collection, we fully support that. In terms of, I think the only other one that I haven't mentioned is the requirements for the register. Now, this particular part, again, we see potential to that, but we need to be able to understand that better. Yes, we understand it's actually going to cover a smaller majority of the cases that are heard on solemn procedure rather than summary procedure, and that is a small percentage. But then again, yes, it is the most serious of offences that we want on this register, or that is how we understand it. Because what often tends to happen with women, especially with BME women, who face a lot of barriers in navigating the legal process, they often find themselves the other end. So they could be the ones who are being alleged of committing the abuse, not because they're abusers as such, but they couldn't navigate the process. They were either given the wrong advice, or there was a situational abuse, which was almost like what you could call it as a defensive position on the abusive situation. Now, we would not want those women getting caught up in this sort of register. And again, we just need to understand the timeframes and everything, and how it will work with the existing structures better.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a really helpful opening comment. I'll come to Agnes now.
Yeah, good morning. The Scottish Women's Convention also welcomes the intent of the bill and its preventative intent. And but we do also have a number of concerns. And when we spoke to women about this particular bill, a number of the issues that came up with us was, along with the data in Scotland has already been reported, is not of the standard it should be in this day and age. And I think that's something that this bill has drawn attention to yet again. But the lived experience of women, the women that we speak to, they still report this fear of reporting due to inadequate protection. And a number of incidents, like high incidents, repeated incidents, involve repeat perpetrators, so it could be the same person, the same man really committing that. But the other issue that we have, well, amongst the other issues that we have, is this idea of self-reporting. I mean, I don't know where on earth we think that's going to happen, to be honest, because to ask men to put their hand up and say, yeah, I did that, or I did this, or I'm here, or whatever the reporting structure demands of them. I mean, from the beginning, they're denying responsibility of the actual crime in the main, and now and this asks them to involve in self-reporting. What we do agree with, and it's maybe a long time coming in Scotland, is the education of our young people about violence against women and girls across the spectrum anyway, but in terms of this so-called domestic abuse. And I do wish there was another name for it, because there's nothing domestic about it. But I do think that that is a big area where we should be focusing as a Scotland. And when people say, and I'm one of them, what kind of Scotland do we want to live in? And it's one that's where women are free from the fear of violence. Then I think that when we talk to our young people as early as possible about how we respect each other, and how in Finland, for example, and youngsters at school learn how not to bully and so on. And I think that's where the bill identifies that part of something we can work with. But in terms of the actual mechanisms of it, I think that it's asking a lot of the agencies that currently exist. It's asking a lot of individuals about how we make this happen. So in terms of the Scottish Women's Convention, we would be inclined to say that it needs a lot more work.
Okay, thank you very much, Agnes. And finally, Debbie, I'll bring you in now.
Oh, good morning. So I did mine a little bit different. I've sort of wrote bits down, if that's all right, and I'll read what we thought. So the views on the proposal, we sort of looked at it as a team, and I've brought my team's views. So we thought that introducing the notification requirements would close an important gap in public safety. At the moment, domestic abuse offenders are not monitored in the same way as registered sex offenders, which to us, it doesn't make any sense, but we get that it's different and there would be some work around that and things would be a little bit different. We believe that there is an epidemic and that there needs to be deterrence put in place, because at the minute there is no deterrence. We see repeat offenders time and time again going through the court process, getting a slap on the wrist. You know, there's no deterrence sort of from them. And a requirement to inform the police of details like address, passport, we feel may improve safety. We don't know, because as everybody else has said, there still needs to be quite a bit of work done on how that will happen, and how it will help agencies manage. Will it help agencies manage risk more effectively? We don't know, but anything sort of worth trying at the moment. Knowing where perpetrators are living, to us, that could help how victims feel. because only too often they get housed very close to the victims, obviously causing a lot of trauma, and that enables the perpetrators to carry on controlling them and to traumatising the victims. So sort of the definition of the Domestic Abuse Offender Bill, we agreed, we felt it was right, but we feel that there needs to be considerations about counter-allegations, and I think that came up time and time again with us. What would happen if a victim is charged with domestic abuse once the person had felt safe enough to disclose that abuse to people that are supporting them? You know, and they did recognise that they was a survivor and there had been retaliation. Would they be able to be removed from that register? Again, concerns about repercussions of this and how would it affect that victim. Also, how would it work with repeat offenders that are not convicted at lower levels of domestic abuse? Because as we know, this again can begin to escalate. Also, we thought, you know, some perpetrators, they have learning disabilities, you know, so there would be all that to be taken into account as well. So we do feel it would be of a help, but again, as others have said, we do feel there needs to be some more work around that.
Okay. I'll just pause you there, Debbie, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm keen to let members come in with their lines of questioning, so thank you for that. So I will pause there and I'll bring in Liam Kerr and then I'll bring in Rona Mackay.
Many thanks, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'll come to Tume Forster first of all, and then I'll go to Dr Scott, but anyone else that wants to come in. The bill proposes to apply to offenders who are convicted on indictment of an offence involving domestic abuse. Now, my understanding is that the majority of cases go through the summary courts. Now, if that's right, do you think, Tume Forster, that there's a risk that having such a distinction risks sending out a message that there are, if you like, two tiers of domestic abuse, rather than saying all domestic abuse is wrong?
I suppose what the message that we're trying to send out here, my take on it, is at the moment there is nothing. Again, I'm going to answer it from a BME domestic abuse perspective. Considering the BME communities just now, where a lot of honour-based abuse, forced marriage exists, the general understanding of the community is there is nothing out there that will hold me accountable to what I have done. So we welcome anything that would actually give the message that it is not right, it is not correct. But yes, whilst I do agree, definitely there's a large percentage of the cases that are not going to be part of this, quite a large percentage. But then again, if it's even if it's going to be holding those ones with the most serious cases, offenders, to accountable, it will actually, in my opinion, it might act as a deterrent to give that message, to say that it is not okay. Now, if the idea of it is to stop it completely, which we know that's not likely, but if the idea of it is a deterrent or to stop people from repeat offending, it might achieve that outcome. But then again, I'm not sure, because obviously there needs to be more work into that. From a BME community now, because the way I understand it, also the part of this is also on the management of these offenders, which we feel these are the most serious cases, and these individuals are most danger and harm to the society. That's my take on it. Now, if that is the case, then we have to look at the risk assessment of it, and that at the moment for the BME communities is not there. So that's what we're hoping that this could help maybe. For example, we can talk about MARAC, the multi-agency where they're looking at risk assessments. Now, MARAC responses around the country in Scotland today for BME individuals varies. It's a very varied response. Now, I can actually tell you in Edinburgh MARAC, you could not bring an HBA case because that would not be heard. However, we do have a separate forum for the HBA cases where we are part of it.
I take it you're referring to honour-based abuse?
Yes, I am. Yes, absolutely. But what I'm saying is, because it is actually supposed to be a risk assessment for those women, Now, many BME women who suffer HBA from their partner, ex-partner, so we're talking about intimate partnership, even those cases may not be heard in the main MARAC sittings, which we would then need to go to the separate forum, which again is a risk assessment forum. But then again, most of the time what you would find in all the other MARACs around the country as well, the risk assessment falls on to third sector. So this is the problem. So if there was some statute saying that there is risk assessment for everybody out there, even if it's a small percentage, on most serious offences, that would be welcome. But like again, once I said, we just need to understand how it fits in with the existing structures, because we want to protect the existing structures, but we want to see that fitting in and working in conjunction with that.
Scott, on the indictment point.
Yeah, I think 85% of domestic abuse cases go through summary court. So I think this is a focused measure, which I will have to say we have resisted for a lot of years this notion that somehow you can say that a case that's on indictment is serious or more serious, because if you look at the data, the single biggest indicator that you might have lethality involved in a domestic abuse case is coercive and controlling behaviors, and those are pretty much present in all those 85% of cases that are in the summary court. To be honest, I think the message in general at the moment is we don't really take this that seriously, except that we say we do, in part because so many of the sentences that happen don't involve serious GPS monitoring or custodial sentences. That across the piece they involve community disposals. That's a whole nother meeting and discussion, I am quite sure, but I'm less worried about the message that it sends to the public and more what it sends to the legal community, that there are these cases that are serious, but the rest really aren't.
I'll stay with you, Dr. Scott, for a follow-up question, but I'll pose the same to Debbie Jupp straight afterwards. Because in your opening remarks, you talked about, and I think this is what you were saying just now, whether the measures set out in this bill will actually help to reduce domestic violence. And certainly when I was reading my papers, the argument was made that a lot of the point of having a register is about deterrence, such that perpetrators may think twice because they might end up on a register. So the question I put to you is, one would think that if someone currently is a perpetrator of domestic violence and could be convicted for it and could face the full force of the law, but still does it despite that risk of criminality or criminalisation, will a register really deter those sorts of people?
I highly doubt it, I have to say. But haven't seen any evidence. Actually, there isn't much evidence out there about significantly effective deterrent measures. So I can't imagine that it would. I have lots of sympathy with my sister organizations here in terms of, there isn't anything. So why are we not saying at least try this? But actually, I think deterrence is the wrong way to go with this. I think what is it that increases safety of victims? And there's really no evidence that a register will do that significantly, especially for this quite small pool of offenders. What we really need to do is to look at things like investing in legal services for victims, so that and making our legal system work appropriately so they have access to justice. Because what will deter is if they have appropriate legal representation at the beginning of the process. Those are the kinds of things. Investing in the MARAC structures, challenging the use of risk assessments like the DASH, which minimize the impact of coercive and controlling behaviors, which is the single biggest thing we have to worry about in terms of lethality. So we know lots of things that we can do that will increase safety. And trust me, if we're talking about data, for instance, I'd really like us to collect data on perpetrators, and that's the far more important gap in the system than anything. But, really what we're talking about here are investing in things like MARACs, like legal services that we know are inadequate, but we know are critical pillars in safety.
Debbie Jupp, do you have anything to add to that? Or?
Actually, no, I don't. I think you've covered it all.
I know.
In which case, unless Agnes or Tume wish to come in, I shall hand back. Convener.
Very much. Rona Mackay, followed by Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I was going to ask a question, and I will ask it in a much shorter form because it was kind of answered in Dr. Scott's intro, and it was basically just, if I could just go round everybody and ask, do you think this bill will add anything to the current approach, the multi-agency approach? And, and I don't need a long answer because I've got another question, but just that, it was really just to clarify that. Do you think the bill is necessary and will it fit into the current structure? Can I start with you, Debbie?
Okay. Actually, yes, I do think that it will help the perpetrators and the tracking of the perpetrators. We have them going from one end of the country to another end of the country. So the things like addresses, collecting that data will help maybe to track where they are, so they're not constantly moving next to where the victims are. So I think the part of collecting the data and the information will really help the victims of domestic abuse that we work with. And I think the part on the school, I think that all children should be educated to help them, to give them that information, to know what a healthy relationship is, to know what domestic abuse is. So I do actually think that the bill will help, but I do, when I look at it, I do feel that there needs to be parts of it that needs to be looked at in more depth than we've actually got at the moment. So,
you feel the good parts outweigh the
I actually do.
concerning parts?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, and with our answers from our CEA team, we did agree with most of it, but we did put parts that we need to look at that, or we would need to look at that part of it. So yeah, I think
Thanks.
I think
Thank
it
you,
does.
Debbie. Dr. Scott?
As I said before, we would warmly welcome improved practice. I'm not sure what would deliver it, I have to say, because it's already in law, around data and collecting data that's not already even on the radar. I wish I could say different, but I think the other three parts of the bill, while well-intentioned, are unlikely to make women and children safer or to hold perpetrators accountable, and might in fact get in the way of existing good practice, much as it needs to still be improved.
Thank you. Jimmy?
We do feel that the bill actually holds a lot of potential. It holds a lot of potential, but maybe there needs to be some further work done, and to, like I said earlier on, just to see how it would fit in with the existing structures, so that it can provide that safety. Because we were actually making a comparison to, for example, the register to the forced marriage protection orders, which we would be familiar with. Now, this was something that was brought on with a lot of promise and things like that, and we thought the BME community would be quite keen to utilise that, and they weren't. There were some who were actually interested, but then the issue was that the communities, they wanted the abuse to go away, but not necessarily want to see the people having criminal records, things like that. However, we do know for a fact that it does keep them safe. So now then, the issue is not so much the order itself, because the order does provide protection, and in this case, the bill would be the same. The bill would be giving that safety, but we need to educate the women, the people who come to us, to tell them how it can keep them safe. But what needs to happen is that security provided for safety that needs to be provided for the women. It is very well actually putting somebody on the register, but unless you can keep the women and children safe maybe on a separate measure, then that's never going to be a complete picture. So, of course, the register will be some of a deterrent, especially it will give a message to the BME communities, I can assure you, because at the moment it's almost like they're really not much. But again, like I say, it needs to be, for example, if it's a register is going to be something very similar to disclosure scheme just now, then how is that going to be different? Is it something that's going to be just utilised and used by the Police Scotland? Because if that is the case, then what use is there for the support organisations? Will the support organisations have the ability to look at the system? Will they have access to the register? Would that be possible now? Because if that was the case, that would be something quite welcoming. But all of these things need to be.
That's a very, very interesting point. Agnes?
Thank you. One of the areas that the bill lacks is the support for the victims, the survivors and their families. I mean, it lacks direct support measures, and I think that's really important. We're in a world in Scotland where we're trying to encourage women to report offences, report this criminal behaviour and the violence that's perpetrated against them. But we need to do something after that. And although the bill talks about different things like education in schools, which is really important, and the data collection and reporting, and my colleagues on the panel have been much more eloquent than I am about that. But we need provisions for safe housing pathways, trauma-informed mental health, and legal. Marsha spoke about that as well. We need legal advocacy and resources that women can use. But the specialist third sectors, like Women's Aid, they need a specialist fund. They need to be sustainable in delivering these services to women. And I don't think the bill does that. The bill does, and that in itself, if women haven't a safe route out of this domestic abuse, then how on earth are we going to get them to report? We all know in this room how underreported these offences are. And to enable women to report it, we need to say to them, we believe you, and this is how you're going to be housed. Why is it always the women that have to leave the house with the children? Why is that always, or nearly always, the case? And I do think there has to be more onus on our Police Scotland to start recording, taking seriously these cases against women, these violence against women cases, and they're not just this cosy word domestic when we talk about abuse. And I think that I was listening to Eilish Angelini yesterday talking about her report, and she was talking about how we have to move these offences against women further up the agenda to be taken more seriously and not just slotted in somewhere. So for me, the bill is well-intentioned, and the women we spoke to agree with that. Every little helps, but they don't see, when they talk about their own personal circumstances, how this will move it along.
Thank you, Agnes. You beautifully led me into my next question, and it's really about resources and rehabilitation for women, and do you think the bill addresses that? So I will move on, because you've answered. I absolutely understand what you've said, and you made some really good points. So I'll go back to Debbie. Do you think the bill addresses the resources will be there for adequate follow-through and rehabilitation?
For men? Or for the perpetrators?
For the domestic abuse victims.
So, not particularly, no. I think a lot of funding does need to be put into the victims. Currently, in our service, we've got a waiting list of 106 people. Domestic abuse shouldn't have a waiting list. They should be able to access that support straight away. We are seeing more and more referrals coming through the service constantly, and we have equivalent of 3 full-time staff to deal with the massive influx of clients coming through the service. So I think there needs to be more in rehabilitation for women. There needs to be more psychological support. We've got GPs, we've got all members of the health service referring into a small charity like ours to get support for clients that are psychologically traumatised. So there's not enough support there for them. There definitely needs to be more money put into domestic abuse. It's supposed to be a priority, and we are looking at, obviously in this bill, how can we track perpetrators more and collect data and things like that. But agreement and what you said, Marcia, we do need to be looking at the other side as well. How can we put more funding into working with the survivors or the victims, whichever you want to call them. There needs to be more groups available. We're always told there's no pots for the money. Third sector charities are always spending half the time trying to apply for funding and then getting knocked back instead of putting the work into what they need to be doing. So, yeah, probably not in the bill.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcia.
I think I'll just touch on the 2 pieces that I haven't talked a lot about, which is the rehabilitation element. I think it's really important for us to remind ourselves that in the best possible world, where every court and every, community had access to a perpetrator program, that we still see a minority of good outcomes. We still should do those. I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but and I think people want a perpetrator program to be a quick fix, and they just aren't. And there have been years and years of research and work to develop the Caledonian. And, again, with my caveat, it seems to me that's the system we should be supporting and investing in. I think it's available in 2/3 of the communities or local authorities in Scotland. If we wanted to invest in rehabilitation, we should make sure that the funding's available to extend it everywhere and to fund it appropriately, so that, because the critical piece of it is the support programs for partners and ex-partners, because that gives you the data feedback loop to tell you whether actually perpetrators are actually changing. So that, I think that would be my response on that one. And in terms of the school programs, we have a really strongly evaluated Equally Safe in Schools program. We all know that the prevention of domestic abuse can't be put on the shoulders of 14-year-olds, and it needs to be done by the people who are, well, younger than me, most of them. And that prevention of domestic abuse, according to Scottish policy for the last 25 years, is about addressing the inequality so that women aren't disproportionately poor, so that children don't lack access to their human rights, so that women don't have to be the ones that leave. There's a whole set of things that we know to do, and those are the things that will best prevent domestic abuse. I'm going to get off my soapbox, sorry.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Just for clarification, are we referring to resourcing in general on all four parts?
Yes, resourcing in general, I think, yeah.
Yeah. So this aspect is, for us, like I said, this is why I was referring to when I said how it will fit in with the existing structures, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel, because it all comes down to resourcing and budgeting. That part is not fully clear in the bill itself. We can see that there is some suggestion of reliance, obviously, on the third sector. Now, I have to make a point from a third sector perspective because of what we do. And again, how much extra workload or how much extra is expected from third sector organisations? Now, we do not, for example, Shakti Women's Aid being a specialist organisation, they will have the knowledge and understanding of those culturally and traditional driven behaviours, issues, and we would not, of course, absolutely, we would be very happy to share that with everybody, but there is the reality of funding issues, there is the reality of resourcing for ourselves. There's only so many of us, so now what is expected from us in realistic terms and what we can deliver in terms of what is expected from us. So the resourcing, I think, is something that probably needs to be worked on somewhat more in the bill. And again, budgeting for me is similar. Of course, that will be something that will be looked at. But yes, resourcing for me is not 100% clear and how it will fit in with the existing structures, so that will, of course, help alleviate some of that resourcing issues. How you can fit, for example, like what Marcia was saying with the Caledonian project, is a program that is trusted out there. Absolutely, we should be using that. But will this new bill fit in? And where it fits in, what is it proposing to change or add? Now, having that in the statute, that's brilliant. And actually, that is making sure that there is that accountability for everyone out there in Scotland today, saying, okay, if we want it fully diverse, we just have to have in all stages of the process. But how is it going to work? And yes, and the resourcing part probably is not very clear.
That's very helpful from everybody, because I think what we're trying to do is to establish how effective this bill could be and what practical change it could make. So the comments have really been helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Jamie Hepburn, then Sharon Dowie.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning to the panel. I have some questions predicated on the specific written submissions that we have, so they're probably going to be quite specific questions for individuals. And the first area relates to notification requirements and monitoring, and I was struck with the point that was made in the Scottish Women's Aid submission, which, in terms of setting out the views and the proposals, says, after consultation with colleagues across the system, we are not confident this element of the proposal would actually make engagement with the justice system safer, and we see significant unintended negative consequences, which is a pretty stark thing to say and to hear. And in the Scottish Women's Convention submission, in terms of the specific question around safety, it says protective orders which are imposed without requiring victims to survivors to initiate legal action can reduce safety. Again, that's a pretty stark thing to hear. So I suppose those are specific points to put to Marcia Scott and Agnes Tolmie respectively, in terms of what you've said. If you can expand a little further.
I actually think I've probably pretty much covered it. We just have concerns that as well intended as the proposal is, and I don't want anybody to think that we wouldn't like to know that the system and the police and the courts could identify where a perpetrator was at any given moment, but I don't think this is going to do that. And I think, one of the things that we would like to look at would be things like development of using technology like GPS monitoring in ways that that we know in other countries it's used, and that build women's confidence that they're actually safe, and make it very clear to people who are being monitored that that their behaviors will be responded to if they break the protective orders or whatever are in place. But in general, I guess quite a small number of perpetrators would be affected by this, and we know from lots of evidence over decades that even if you look at protective orders, that the perpetrators or the convicted offenders who abide by the rules of a protective order are the ones who are in general fairly compliant with the law. And there's a whole set of very scary offenders who don't anyway. And so being required to volunteer their previous records or being on a register is unlikely to change their behaviour in terms of whether they're putting victims at risk.
So I get the sense they have a very strong view about the efficacy of the proposals. Maybe not so much, if you say a little bit more, because it's a pretty stark thing to say, significant unintended negative consequences.
That would be related to the fact that we're talking here about a system that doesn't work very well as it is, and this would be imposing. And this is one of we had multiple conversations with colleagues in the public sector, and they're very concerned that what this would do would be to require them to go through bureaucratic processes that would not really deliver for victims or survivors, and might draw resources away from other areas that do.
And Agnes, on your point about a reduction in safety?
Well, I think one of the things that we have to remember is the nature of these abusers, and particularly when they are controlling men. And we find women say to us that one of the things that they worry about when it becomes bureaucratic is that it'll only make them madder. These are the kind of expressions that we hear, that the more you impose a thing that doesn't work on them, you're just making them madder. And women just want out and away, or the whole problem to stop. What we fear is some of the proposals in this bill would make him madder, and women would say to us, well, we don't want him madder, we just want it to stop. And for us, it's got back to what Marsha's saying as well. There are men out there whose controlling behaviour is so bad that it takes women years and years just to even report any abuse in the first place. So to then start going through this bureaucratic process rather than deal with the perpetrator the way that they should be reflects back on them. And women will tell us that the targeted prevention is a much better way to go, that we can actually say, but we actually can say to these men, this is a programme that you're going to go through, and that's part of the rehabilitation. But if they don't do that, if it's just, well, you're going to have to report to us or wear an ankle bracelet or something else, then women have that fear.
And that's drawn from specific conversations that you've had as an organisation with victims.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I've got some questions on the issue around domestic abuse education in schools, which I think we would all understand broadly as a good idea and something to put in place. But again, Scottish Women's Aid had something pretty stark comments around the specific propositions. In your response, you say the proposal as stands raises some alarms for us. The implications for children, parents who choose to withdraw their child, for children in the class who disclose abuse and are said not properly trained to respond safely for the child, are two scenarios that we worry about. So I guess that's a specific question to Marsha, maybe a general question for everyone. I mean, and that speaks to the point. There are going to be kids in a classroom. You know, sadly, the prevalence of abuse. There are going to be kids in the classroom who've witnessed this, who've experienced this. And I guess the question might be, there's clearly inherent danger of re-traumatisation. How do we deal with that in the school environment? So maybe, Marsha, you first have cited your...
Yeah, I mean, I think, allowing parents to pull their children out raises all kinds of questions and issues in a school system, and either we think children need something or we don't. We don't ask if you want to pull your child out of English. Do you know what I mean? However, having said that, and it is very hard, and I have to say I have this conversation in so many places, so many times a month. People's idea of prevention is do a school program. And I'm always reminded, there was a piece of research, I think it was the Young Women's Project, that did a piece of research with young women in schools and around their experiences of sexism. And they were like, so should we do curriculum-based interventions around how wrong sexism is, and gender rights and all that. And one of the young women said, well, until I walk out of that class into the hallway and don't get sexually assaulted, it's kind of hard for me to take that seriously. And when women all around Scotland live in a world where domestic abuse is rife and 1 in 5 children grow up with it, doing an intervention in schools that says that you should be nice, right, is worthy, but it's highly unlikely to prevent domestic abuse. What will prevent domestic abuse is if, when the kids walk out of that classroom, the women aren't more poor, the girls aren't being sexually assaulted in school, and I do think there's absolutely a place for curriculum-based work, which is about the history of, of oppression that women, that other very marginalized groups experience, and how unproductive, inefficient, and harmful it all is, and the world that we want to create is different. But going in and doing specific domestic abuse curriculum without doing the rest of that makes people feel good, but it probably doesn't do much to prevent domestic abuse.
And I suppose the general question to you all is the issue of potential traumatisation or re-traumatisation for children. How would that be dealt with?
Just say kids are traumatized by going on watching stuff on TikTok. Do you know what I mean? I'm not sure that I would say we really like awareness raising in schools for one reason, which is that young people don't see themselves as victims of domestic abuse when they're living with it in a family. Or in their own relationships. And it's really good to let them know that there are services like these folks provide and like we oversee that are designed for children and young people, and that those are available to them for free. That they should see themselves as, in the constituency of people who have a right to this kind of support. I don't think talking to them about domestic abuse will re-traumatize them. I do think that, depending on how it's done, of course, but I don't think it's going to help them particularly unless you link it with what the local support services are.
Okay, that's a useful perspective. I don't know if others have anything to say in relation to that.
So at CEA we do have a team of children's workers that do go into schools, so they work one-to-one with children, and they've also done some projects as well with whole classes, which we've found really positive, the feedback from that. Obviously, if a child is experiencing domestic abuse, it needs to be done for an age and stage, so it's done in the right way. Social work referring to our service constantly. We've got the biggest number of children on the Child Protection Register. All other services, they all refer in as well. So we've got a waiting list for that because it is such a good help to children. They do safety planning. They make sure children are aware of what to do if there's a domestic abuse incident happening in the home. So we think rolling it out to schools and in classes would help a lot more children that we can do on a one-to-one basis. Obviously, things need to be taken into concern. There is going to be children in those classes that are experiencing domestic abuse. That's something that we would have to look at. How do we do that? But at the minute, there is a big requirement for these children to get help and support. We have a play therapist, we have filial therapists working with the families. So there's a lot of good work that's already going on. Again, lack of funding.
That sounds more like that's direct support for those who are experiencing it as opposed to general education.
Yes, and that's what I'm saying. So we're already doing some of that work, rolling it out into schools. Like you say, how would we not traumatise children that are not coming forward, that are experiencing that in the home? So I can see what you're saying, Marshall, on that point. But at the minute, we do it on a one-to-one basis. Okay. And we've had feedback about people that we've actually gone into classes and delivered it to the whole classes, that it was really helpful.
Thank you.
No, Agnes would like to come in, if that's... Agnes?
I do think that education is important, and I think our young people would benefit from education, not just about focused domestic abuse, but how we respect each other and how we should like each other and not harm each other. we have to do something to combat the online rubbish that our young people are engaged in. And I think if nothing else for that, and I think the misogyny, we had a conference recently on misogyny in education, and the number of young women, young girls in third, fourth, fifth year, whatever, would tell us about examples of where they were being hurt at school or injured. And thankfully, as an outcome from that, many schools are now doing processes where it can be reported. But that doesn't take away from the fact that we need to get into young people's heads very early about what's right and what's wrong, about how we treat each other, and that women are not baddies as we are portrayed on social media. I mean, one young girl told us she was pushed down the stairs by a boy, and the reason he did it, he told her, was because I don't like women, I don't like girls. So there's a problem there, and we need to get in and address that. I mean, I was quite saddened, actually, that the misogyny bill we were promised never came to fruition, because I think that would have helped to sharpen the mind of a few people of what was right and what was wrong.
Okay, I have a couple of, but I'm conscious of timekeeping. Maybe if there's time,
If there's time at the end, yeah, I'll bring you back in. No
Thank
problem. Okay, Sharon Dowie, then Pauline McNeill.
Thank you. Good morning. I've got more questions. You have answered some earlier in your responses to Rona Mackay, but do you have any comments on the financial and resource aspects of the bill that you haven't already raised? And just on that, we heard from Pam Gosling, MSP, on the 25th of June that the maximum cost of the bill would be £23 million, but this would be worthwhile by achieving an estimated £7 billion in savings from domestic abuse offending. So do you think the £23 million is realistic, or are there other things that you think should be considered within the financial memorandum? If you've got any other comments, I'll start with Tina.
It's very difficult to say. It would be, and like I said earlier on, whether it's going to be factored into the existing systems, existing structures, or they're going to be a considerable increase in resourcing. Say, for example, in the register, is that going to be on Police Scotland? Now, what kind of resourcing do we need? Is it going to be sitting on top of what we have in the disclosure scheme, or is it going to be in conjunction with that, or is it going to be rolled out to the other women's groups? Who is going to have access? And that brings on further issues around resourcing side of things. For us, it is very difficult to say resourcing from what we have seen in the bill.
Okay, thank you.
I don't really have anything to add to what I've said.
Nothing to add. Okay.
No,
No, nothing. Agnes?
No, I couldn't put a figure on it either. But I think if there's a £23 million lying about there through in Holyrood, I'm sure Women's Aid would make good use of it.
I'm sure there's a lot of organisations would make good use of it. It's just there was comments about education and how they would prefer to see a specialist person coming in and delivering education rather than a school teacher. Or are those costs addressed, do you think? Do we need to put more in? Given the potential savings, so we heard that it would be a £23 million cost, but there's a potential savings of £7 billion from domestic abuse reoffending. So, sorry, Dr. Scott.
From my perspective, what's being proposed, and is often elsewhere, is that we do curriculum-based interventions. So you'd have to develop the curriculum, you'd have to test it, and then you'd have to train your teachers to deliver it if you were actually serious about it. And I have no idea what that would cost. I do think that if you want to do an education, a curriculum-based intervention, then you should do it in partnership with your local services to make sure that we're hooking kids up. But I don't think we should be asking voluntary sector organizations with waiting lists to be then doing, curriculum-based interventions. And I guess my feeling about the 27 million and the however many billion is there isn't an awful lot of evidence that there's going to be very many cases prevented in this, although every case is worth preventing. So I think the figures are very, very difficult to grapple with, given the amount of uncertainty in all of it.
One final question. Just earlier on, you had said that colleagues in public sector had concerns about the bureaucracy. Could that be addressed by extra funding? And I don't know if you can concisely tell us what the public sector concerns were and who it was.
I don't want to speak for partners, but I will say that obviously, so for instance, I'm sure this committee is well aware of the failure to implement the domestic abuse elements of the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Bill, and the DAPOs and the DAPNs. And I think we already know that there's a significant resource issue for police. And if we continue to expect them to do these other things that they haven't done, in part because of resourcing, and then lay something else on them, I think that we're highly unlikely to have an effectively positive outcome there.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Pauline McNeill, then Katie Clark.
Thank you. Good morning. Could I start with asking Toomey just to maybe elaborate a wee bit more on the evidence you've given about this issue of women who might be convicted because they've retaliated in self-defence. Now, I wasn't really aware of this until Pam Gossel mentioned it to me as being a kind of big issue, and I think it'd be quite helpful to understand that as part of the process.
Yes, so this is an issue, a big issue, particularly in case of BME women, that they find it incredibly difficult to navigate the legal system. They have very not much understanding at all what even in case of what it means to plead guilty or not guilty. All they can think of is, in many women's cases, especially if they have children as well, all they want is the abuse to stop and for them to keep their children. And we have had cases of women where they were led to believe that if they plead guilty, they can take their children back. So many women at that point, they have not much understanding of the abuse that's happening around them in any case. And they're thinking that if I'm going to get my child, I'm just going to accept anything. I'm just going to plead anything. They do not understand what that guilty pleading means for them now or in the future. So we have had cases like that, especially with the issues around the legal protection's not quite there. Legal aid is very difficult to come by, and they're basically left in the hands of solicitors and people who want to just expedite that process. Because if you go to the courts, there's long waiting times, and people want quick outcomes, not necessarily the good outcome for the woman and the child to keep them safe.
In these cases, so the woman has been charged with an assault, for example?
Yes, well, basically, the women often find themselves, I don't want to call it like a retaliatory, because it isn't. It is actually almost like a defence mechanism that the woman, or like I said earlier, it's like a situational. The woman, so the woman is actually resisting to that abuse. She's trying to keep herself and her child safe. Now, resisting to that, not necessarily meaning that she's an abuser as such, but it is literally defending herself and her child to keep safe. But
arguing self-defence in those cases in court?
It couldn't, because then, of course, there will be a counter-allegation from the partners. And often what happens, for example, in BME women's cases, that they rely on financially on the husbands. They come to this country, many of them being first-generation migrants. They do not know how the system works. All they know is they were brought here by their husbands, so they will rely on them 100%. And often we would find men coming forward and saying, well, she's done this, 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 and this. Well, he says all of these things because he knows how the system works. And she has no idea. So actually, she wouldn't even be able to say, well, I was just doing that. It's almost like a self-defense. She wouldn't be able to explain that.
Just add.
Yeah.
Which is... I'm really glad you raised this, and I think you did too. So counter-allegations are a really big problem in the system. And if we wonder why women don't want to report, and the number of women who are actually victims who are the perpetrator uses the system or the perpetrator's lawyer to invoke her being the perpetrator rather than the victim. We're involved with the Scottish Women's Rights Centre right now and doing a whole study on dual and malicious reporting. It's an issue in every system that responds robustly to domestic abuse. But what we find are police are required to identify the primary aggressor in a case, and we used to have lots of cases where both partners would be reported as being violent, and then the courts were asked to sort it out. And so we had a new protocol some years ago, worked quite well at reducing the dual reports, but unfortunately the unintended negative consequence is that we are still seeing a significant number of malicious reports. And what happens then is that somebody, and it may not even be that she doesn't, it may be that she does understand the legal system, but she's being treated as a perpetrator instead of as a victim. Yeah.
And that is your concern to me about the register, that those women would be on the register.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to explore something that's really struck me that Agnes Tomley has said about angry men. First of all, Agnes, hello. Can I just check, is this your concern about the notification requirements to be on the list, that those men on that list, it almost be like a provocation? Is that your concern? That will not keep women safe, but actually be provocative because it might lead to more violence? Is that what you meant?
Yeah, what it does, and when women talk to us about anything that can, it's like poking this guy with a stick, you're just making him more angry, and it can cause fractious behaviour. The kind of examples that were given to us were, if I don't want to annoy him because he'll start messing me about the kids, or he'll not give me money, and various other things like that. If they've managed to escape, but they've still got to let him see the children, for example, by putting them on a register, you're making them angrier, and so on and so forth.
That's what I thought you said, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's really striking comment you've made. Can I ask other witnesses, is that your view as well about the register?
There would be a concern that it would make them angrier, but again, it would be the police that would have committed offence, and if they've been charged, it wouldn't be that person's fault that they would go on that register. So I sort of see it from two sides.
Mm-hmm.
I would just say, we can't. I think we hear those things all the time, also, Agnes, and I think this is about the risk assessments that victims do and survivors do about if there is a response to putting somebody on the register that absolutely makes women and children safer, then they're not going to worry. We're not going to worry about him being angry or because he can't get to her. Do you know what I mean? But unfortunately, our system provides access through child contact, through all kinds of things. So she's not safer, and he's angry. But also, domestic abuse is not about him being angry. It's about him having power.
I know, but I just want to understand that.
It's an excuse for him to be angry.
Can I just say this is a central part of the bill, and that comment to me is very pertinent. So I just wanted to get your reaction to that, because the purpose of putting, as I understand it, the purpose of putting the convicted offender on the list is so that the police can monitor. I'll acknowledge what you said about resources and everything else, but that would be the purpose of it. So it's quite interesting to hear that there might be an unintended consequence. To me, do you want to answer that?
So for me, this is actually a difficult one maybe to manoeuvre. However, we cannot not keep people accountable because they will get mad. if there is a crime, for me, domestic abuse is a crime. And if there is a crime, you cannot just, in a way, not take action on it, because it will make them mad. It will make them angry. Yes, undoubtedly it will. It most certainly will. And I can guarantee you, in terms of honour-based abuse cases, it will make the families very mad, because then we have the multiple perpetrator concept. You put the man on the register, well, the rest of the family will be quite mad as well, because, again, we have that multiple perpetrator concept. However, in the eyes of the law, we cannot just let someone get away with it because they will get upset. Because if that was the case, then we have to review the whole system. We have to take action on it. That is my view on it. But yes, will it actually make some people very angry? I'm sure it will.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just lastly, if I may ask...
I think Agnes wants to come in before you move on, Pauline.
Yep.
Agnes, come on in.
Yeah, I think the point, thank you. The point I'm making is that we're telling you what women are telling us. It's not about these men not being on a register. It's about the fear that women have that they're the ones that have put them there. And that, I think, it has to be done differently. This bill doesn't address that. The bill says, right, there will be a register and you'll be on this register for 4 times your the length of your sentence and so on. But what women are telling us is that if they can escape that whole abuse, then that is preferable to them than having this man, this angrier man, because depending on the type of abuse that these women are facing, the reaction will be different. I think it's what we see is we want the justice to take place, and justice has to land on the shoulders of the men. I totally agree that they should be put on a register or wherever are behind bars. Doesn't matter to me where they put them, but what it does matter is the consequences. Again, unintended consequences on the women. We just need to be careful about how we do it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Just lastly, I've got a special interest in this whole of the issue about the curriculum that you mentioned, so I just wanted to ask you very briefly about this. My personal view, and I've expressed this many times, is I think that we need to work with everyone, but we need to work with boys. And I've been following, some men have been speaking out about this, David Candy this week. Some notable figures are saying that boys don't have the role models that we need in society. I just simply wondered if you agreed that some of the work we need to do needs to be targeted at boys and talking to boys. Because if we don't tackle the root of the problem, then we won't tackle domestic abuse. It was just really what you thought about working with boys at any age, given your experiences and your expertise.
So we already work with boys. As I said about the children in the school, we work with boys and we work with men. I think we're one of the only domestic abuse agencies in Scotland that do work with men. We have lots of calls from men all around the country. Obviously, it's done over the phone because they're not going to come to the office. But we do agree that boys should be given the education as well as women, because it does affect them. I was at a college last week doing an open day, and I had 3 teenage boys come up to us and said, would somebody be able to come to college and talk to the boys about domestic abuse, because they see it, they hear about it. So I thought that was quite interesting, because it's normally girls. Boys wouldn't normally come up to a domestic abuse sort of a stall in a college and do that. So I definitely think that we should be doing that.
Thanks. Martha?
Oh, Pauline, you know, I'm not going to really be helpful here. There really isn't any convincing evidence that role models are important elements in changing harmful behaviors. Or male role models, I guess is what I would say. And, you know, children need good adult role models, but I think we do need to work with boys, but we need to work with boys in the context of the fact that, you know, a really significant percentage of them grew up with domestic abuse. And we know that domestic abuse is not, it's not about them repeating the behavior that they've learned. It's not a learned behavior, unlike the cycle of abuse people. What we need to do with boys is to change a system that rewards them for being harmful and abusive by, investing in systems that that allow them. This is a whole nother hearing, but that allow them, that, for instance, parental leave is a cultural issue. So if they have equal access to the things that would support them to be the kind of parents we all want men to be, then that would make a big difference. But I don't think that as designed in many places, not just this bill, education really thinks about what needs to change around boys in order to help them think about women differently. And I'm as worried about toxic media as anybody else, but let's do something that works.
Yes, we are actually a strong advocate for working with boys, especially for the BME communities. A lot of the abuse is based on male power, where even the females in BME communities will actually try to honour the male honour in a way. So and unfortunately for most young BME girls and boys, the only opportunity that they will get in understanding of a healthy relationship may be the school. Because while they're in their own communities, while they're in their own homes, they're still very much engrossed with that culturally driven, traditionally driven role models. So, and we find this with many young boys and girls, that in a school it is a controlled, a structured way of delivering what a healthy relationship looks like, how boys should treat girls and girls should, that interaction with boys, because they will not have this opportunity in their own home. So that part for us, the educating part of this bill is very important. We welcome that very much. And actually, if you ask us, it should be mandatory, because that would be the only opportunity for a BME boy or a girl to get that information in a controlled and structured manner. And yes, and because it's very much driven from a male honour, if you look at honour-based abuse dynamics, it would be very helpful to work with boys. But of course, to work together with boys and girls so that they understand each other. And if we are truly talking about a diverse and inclusive Scotland, every boy should understand from a girl's perspective and girl from a boy's perspective, and even different people coming from different ethnicities should understand those dynamics so that then these young people then grow up to be the adults of tomorrow.
Pause you there.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Katie Clark, and then there's one or two follow-up questions, including Pam Gosel. Katie.
Thank you. And some of this bill obviously would require legislation. Part one, I think you would have to have legislation to bring it into effect, although we've had the evidence that you think it may have unintended consequences. It may not fit well in with systems that already exist. But other parts of the bill, we don't actually need legislation. And I know from sitting in this committee that quite a lot of legislation that was passed in the last Parliament still hasn't been implemented. So, for example, yesterday it was female genital mutilation legislation that was being focused on that hasn't been implemented. So even if we manage to get this bill passed, it may be a long time before there's work done in implementation. But there's obviously work going on now, for example, on the issue of school education. We know that about a third of schools, I think, are signed up for Equally Safe, but that looks like very different things in different parts of the country. And I've heard very, very clearly the evidence about the scale of sexism, misogyny and violence across the school and how it's just not been dealt with, so we can't silo it into PSE and modern studies classes. But in terms of if we were going to go ahead with mandatory school education relating to domestic abuse, is it actually helpful to restrict it just to domestic abuse, or does it need to be framed in a far wider way around about sexism, misogyny, violence? Which we know violence in schools, particularly against women, both women staff and women pupils, is a massive problem against the backdrop of social media and the influence of the far right. Is it helpful, if we are going to go down the path of mandatory education, to frame it so narrowly, just on domestic abuse?
What about healthy relationships?
Well, is it help? So
if you put, well, you can cover a lot of those things in healthy relationships. I would be putting that in as well.
Can I just say, Liz Kelly, who's a longtime researcher in violence against women, once pointed out that if you look at women's lives, they're not divided into domestic abuse, sexual assault, street harassment, yada, yada. So your point's very well made, I think, in the sense that if we were starting from what is it children need, we wouldn't just give them a domestic abuse case. What we would probably do, if somebody gave me the magic wand, right, is we would look at how to make our schools from nursery on up to graduation, giving messages about gender equality. But the single biggest curriculum intervention that I think would be helpful for children and reduce harm that they experience is media literacy. That has good evidence. It's a tool, it's a skill that can be applied in lots of different ways, and it can challenge the incel movements, the messages that are coming from all the places that scare us old people so much. But I can't ever get away from the fact that unless you deal with the sexism in the hallways, and the whole school approach, then we just beat teachers up for not, somehow knowing about all these ways and these issues around abuse, and then being able to do an intervention that then changes what happens in the hallway. But unless what happens in the hallway changes, then what happens in the classroom is not going to change.
I do agree. 100% with Marcia. Absolutely. Although any lens of having this taught in schools is very welcome, a wider lens, of course, is better to be able to understand for those young people the gender inequality, which is, of course, the major problem of why we're having that. So a wider lens, yes, perspective would be welcome, but anything would be welcome to educate the minds. Yeah.
Agnes?
Yeah, I've got a real passion about this. I think it's really important, Katie, that when boys and girls go to school, we have to teach them that each of us, male and female, have got a role to play in this world, and it isn't just about how men feel or what women want. And I think it's important that we, and going back to the role model bit as well, I don't think, to be fair, I think we're short on male role models from when I look around, starting from the leader of the Western world. But I think it's important that we get men to get involved in this. We need to get men that the boys respect and admire, to stand up and say that wasn't right what he did. That isn't right what he said, and be more vocal. I think that would be a help. But in terms of at school, I think we need to learn together, and we need to learn. When I first went to school, in secondary school, the boys and girls were separated and all that nonsense. But I think we need to learn together, and we need to share experiences together, and we need to learn together that violence is wrong. And women are good. Women are really good people, and boys need to learn to respect that. And how we do that is somebody else's game. But I think what Marcia says is right. If we stop this discrimination from that early age, but the violence thing, Katie, has really got to stop. I can't believe that in Scotland, a small country like ours, we've got over 8,000 sex offenders on a register. I mean, that is just ludicrous. So the earlier we start, the earlier the intervention, we're having honest conversations about who we are, what we're entitled to or not from life, I think the better for our children.
We're just about 5 minutes out from our scheduled finishing time, but I am going to, with the Public Galleries agreement, extend for another 5 minutes just to allow some supplementary questions to come in. I wonder if I can just maybe begin with a quick question, and it's going back to part 1 of the bill and the notification requirements. And I think, Marcia Scott, you touched on this earlier in relation to the fact that MAPA was not really designed for domestic abuse. And I'm just interested, and I'll maybe just stick with Dr. Scott, if you've got additional views on this in terms of the provision to make all domestic abuse offenders, as they're defined in the bill, subject to MAPA. And I'm aware you did touch on this earlier, so if I can maybe just ask you for a fairly brief response.
Not my strength, as you know. I will say, from when I worked in a local authority, and I was all excited when MAPA was going to be extended from sexual offences to violent offences, because I thought, there we go, we'll have a system that we can use to protect women and children living with domestic abuse. And it became immediately clear to me then, and I have heard this from our partners in the police and community justice, that that MAPA, MAPA works very well for what it was designed for, which is sexual offenders. That is a very different design than what you need for monitoring and scrutinizing the behavior of domestic abuse offenders. The system just doesn't work as designed.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Okay, I'm going to bring in Jamie Hepburn for a very brief, succinct question, and then possibly Liam Kerr, and then I'll bring in Pam Gosel. So, brief questions, if you will.
Yeah, they are very specific, just to individuals can do so. I will be brief. The first is to Agnes, and the evidence provided. Your written evidence, I should say, you refer to it being a significant oversight that the bill does not require the collection of data on all protected characteristics defined under the Equality Act 2010. You specifically cite sexual orientation, gender reassignment, religion or belief, pregnancy, maternity and marriage or civil partnership as omissions. Your written submission does touch on it, but can you maybe set out in the public record some of your concerns about these being omitted?
Well, I think, it's back to what lived experiences are. Jamie are telling us, women with lived experiences are telling us that they can be treated differently by the police and the system if they're not the normal heterosexual couple. And they find that off-putting about making complaints, about processing the harm that they've had. How can, when I go to the police station and whatever, they don't treat me the same way? It's not. There's still a bit of education with our police to be done in terms of what is domestic abuse, to be honest.
Okay, that's really helpful. And one final, again, very quick question. It can be specifically to Debbie, because in relation to the written evidence for committed ending abuse, and it relates to concerns about the human rights and equality implications of the bill. And you say the expansion of notifications and data processing ages privacy rights under Article 8 of ECHR, which I must confess isn't something that...
Can I look at that question?
No, let me just make sure it is your evidence.
I don't remember doing that.
Misattributing it to you.
What number is the one?
Yeah, it's yours for sure. 7.1.
7.1.
I guess my question was if you could just expand on it, but maybe I'm putting you on the spot a little, so if you can then come back and write.
Yeah, can you come back to me, or can I?
If you can come back to us.
Because I think actually my colleague did the last part.
Oh, I see, right. Well, if you could speak to your colleague and say, ask them what they were getting at, that'd be
great.
If
there's maybe an opportunity, or if you feel there's maybe any additional information that you can share with the committee just on the basis of the question, then that would be helpful. Okay. You're welcome. And Liam Kerr, and then Pam goes.
Thank you, Convener. A question for Agnes, please. I was intrigued by the line of questioning of Pauline McNeill and the unintended consequences of a register. There's a thought in my mind which I'd just like you to clear up for me. Let's say we've got a victim who's being abused and reports it. The partner is prosecuted and goes on the register, just like, as we've seen in our papers, the sex offenders register. But this is different, I think, because the victim may well take the partner back. And I think, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that will happen in more cases than not. But the perpetrator is now on a register, and the victim put him there through her report. And presumably, the perpetrator will, there's a risk that the perpetrator uses it against her. Look what you did to me. As you said earlier, it makes him madder. Now, if all of that plays through, is there therefore a risk, Agnes, that the victim may be less likely to report the domestic abuse as a function of the register being brought in?
No, I don't think there's an issue with men who commit crimes, violent crimes, or crimes of violence against women and girls being on a register. It's the terms of this proposed legislation, the length of time that someone's on it, that they've to be reporting or wearing some tracking mechanism. I think that's what women were worried about. Not so much the guy's committed a crime, he's entitled to be on a register and forever however long that takes, but it's these additional requirements of this bill that were worrying women when we spoke to them.
Very great. And Pam goes on.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel, and good morning, committee. I've got two questions. One question, which I'll start off with, is direct just to Marsha, and then I've got an open question to the three other panellists. Marsha, I've spoken to you now on 3 informal meetings. You have responded to 2 formal consultations. To my recollection, and also according to the minutes I have from our one-to-one meeting in July we had in the summer, you had said that my bill is moving on into the right direction with the addition of some amendments. For example, you had said you'd be happy to support the creation of the register if things like, basically, you'd said that the register would include information on where the perpetrator works, because we had said with the address where they lives. You had additionally said that. So I was really surprised to see your latest consultation response, due to the fact that I've been working with you right through to make sure that we have good legislation. I used the whole summer to speak to lots of organisations, including 22 women's aid organisations, the majority of which were supportive of my bill. This was also reflected in the consultation responses, with 5 women's aid organisations indicating their support for the bill, specifically on the register. Oh, sorry,
please.
That's fine. And as you know, I have concerns that organisations funded by the Scottish Government may say one thing publicly and another in informal settings, as this may lead to funding being withdrawn. So what's changed, Marsha, from that?
Nothing's changed, really. And Pam, I remember very distinctly saying to you, I would have to discuss this with colleagues in the police and the court service and the Crown to understand, because the reason I said that I thought the bill was moving in the right direction, which was that I was concerned that a register was not going to be effective. I thought the new version of the bill had essentially removed the idea of a formal register because the wording had changed in the new version. but then when I actually talked to colleagues about it, I saw that what was being proposed would operate very much like the previous one. Now, and I did say about the workplace, because as I said, we'd really like police to be able to put their hands on perpetrators at any given point. Do we think this register will deliver that? No. Do we think that it will, and specifically now that it's very focused on offenders who've been convicted under indictment? It's a very small number of offenders, relatively speaking, and the colleagues that I spoke to had strong concerns that the bureaucratic burden would be very significant, and the amount of safety that would be offered, or even accountability for perpetrators, would be minimal. So I did believe sincerely that I wanted to find ways. I do want to find ways to support all of the mechanisms in this bill. I just couldn't.
Okay. Obviously, because of time, I can't come back. I'll just go on to the next question, if that's okay.
And if you maybe just maybe select one or two of the panel members to respond. Thank you, because we are running out of time.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Pan, for obviously coming today regarding my bill. We're going through the 16 days of activism against sex-based violence, so it's important to raise this awareness of domestic abuse. We know that year after year that basically cases are getting higher. There's also repeat offending rising as well. And many survivors I've spoken to, they're saying that things have not changed. From the consultation responses and from today's evidence, we see that there is some support for the creation of the Domestic Abuse Register and support for the rest of the parts of the bill. Some of you have indicated amendments that will need to improve this bill. So if I could ask, my goal here is to make good legislation. So if this bill passes stage 1, what improvements should be there in stage 2 to ensure that the survivors feel safe and that the burden on public authorities is as minimal as possible? Could I ask Tammy first?
As brief as possible. I think we have, in fairness, we have covered quite a bit of that this morning in terms of where you feel there would be scope to make changes. So if you can keep your
the written submission, if that would help.
Would it help if I just said the fact that would you agree to what I heard today was resources, funding and how it's going to work with existing structures?
That's correct.
Okay. And yourself, Debbie? Yeah, no, I agree. Okay. Agnes?
Yeah, same. I think the focus on collecting the data is really important, Pam.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And apologies for slightly overrunning. So thank you all to our witnesses. That's been a very insightful opening session, and we'll just have a short suspension to allow changeover of witnesses. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. So our next item of business today is to consider the forthcoming reforms of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. As members may already be aware, we are expecting Scottish Fire and Rescue Service to publish its proposals in the new year. But today we have an opportunity to hear from the Fire Brigades Union about their views on the proposed reforms. So I intend to allow up to 60 minutes for this panel, and I refer members to papers 5 and 6. And I also note that the Fire Service's annual report and accounts for 2024 to 25 have now been laid before Parliament, and clerks have circulated a copy of this to members in the normal manner. So this morning I welcome Colin Brown, Executive Council Member for Scotland, and John Mackenzie, Scottish Regional Secretary with the Fire Brigades Union. So you're both very welcome this morning. So can I invite either Colin or John to make some short opening remarks? Colin, over to you.
Thank you, Convener and Committee. And we will try and be succinct as always, but probably inviting John and I to do so is probably quite a challenge. But on behalf of the Fire Brigades Union, we welcome this opportunity to address the committee as it considers the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service Delivery Review. The committee will be aware that the FBU recognised the need for reform in our 2023 Firestorm report. That was a detailed piece of work that actually put members' voices right at the forefront of that conversation. And I think it's a really vital piece of work as the service considers the service delivery review. Committee, I wish to open first by saying that as a trade unionist, it can often sound like we're critical of the workforce and the workers, and by default that's our members. And I want to give an assurance that we are absolutely not. I want to commend FBU members, the thousands of FBU members across Scotland, that every single day working in our fire stations, our control rooms and in support roles do incredible things against a really challenging backdrop, both financially and societally. That should never be lost, that it is our members that carry out that work every single day against such a challenging backdrop. And whilst a lot of our support staff are represented by other trade unions, the work that they do is often the hidden part of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, and without them, our members can't function in the roles that they undertake. The committee took evidence on the 12th of November from the Chief Fire Officer, and I wish to push back very gently against some of the comments that were made, in the sense that the Chief, quite rightly from his perspective, said the service is not in crisis. What I would say is that that's not how our members feel on fire stations and in our control rooms as things are today. We have a crisis in our control rooms that's led the FBU in the last 2 months to issue safety critical notices because our staffing levels are below critical. Now, I don't know how something functions at a level below critical, but that's where we are in control rooms. At the moment, there's a roughly 36% attrition rate within our control rooms, meaning that 36% of the workforce are unavailable to perform their really important function. And I'd encourage the committee to look at the FBU's operator film. It's available on YouTube. Quite happy to share links with the committee at some point. That puts the exact framing on what the role that our control firefighters do every single day. And it is harrowing to watch. So trigger warning if you do decide to watch it. It is quite a harrowing watch, but it is vital that people who are involved in decisions around fire and rescue understand these roles. It's not the experience of our members on stations either. The Health and Safety Executive were informed by the FBU regarding issues in Shetland that led them to issue improvement notices on the service earlier this year. And whilst those critical safety notices and improvement notices are being worked through, these fixes are not quick, but they have been years in the making. The issues have been years in the making. And whilst there may be dispute between ourselves and the Chief as to what crisis actually is and the definition of that, that experience of our members, where they have appliances off the run every single day, they have specialist resources off the run every single day, they have retained duty systems of the 345 pumps that should be available on the streets of Scotland every single day, protecting communities. Roughly 200 of them can be unavailable at any given time. The push to increase reliance on the retained duty system through the Service Delivery Review should be of concern to the people of Scotland, certainly concern to our members. It should be concern to the committee, and it should concern to the public. The withdrawal of 10 whole-time pumps in 2023 was entirely financial. The service had a budget crisis that they had to meet with a temporary removal of 10 pumps. Now, the 10 pumps are not the true story. The 166 firefighter posts that were slashed at the same time is the story. Because when a fire starts, it's a firefighter that puts it out. It's not a pump, it is a firefighter. And that 166 took us to around about 1,200 plus firefighters lost since the single service was created in 2012-13. That's really significant. And committee, the wad of paperwork I have in front of me is 1 month's statistics for the availability reports for appliances across Scotland. That's the specialist appliances. And I'd ask you to give me a date in October, and I'll pull out one of those dates and tell you exactly the impact of that, because this is remembering that we've taken 10 pumps out and 166 firefighters out in 2023, and we still routinely see around about 9-10 appliances off the run every day. We see specialist rope teams reduced to a crew level and a resource level that would be challenging. Water rescue teams, mass decontamination teams, all reduced across Scotland on a daily basis. We are not providing the service that the politicians that sit in front of me today believe we are providing right now. That's why we do believe the service delivery review is a vital piece of work and timely. But some of the direction is a problem for us. Committee, I hope to be able to take the opportunity and take questions on the near £900 million that's projected to be saved by the service. That's almost 3 times the amount that the single service was anticipated to save. That's not been reinvested in fire and rescue. It's not been reinvested in making the service better or safer. We still have crumbling stations. We have rack panel that the service are struggling to get back on top of. We don't have dignified facilities. We're not able to implement the FBU's decom processes across stations. These are legislative responsibilities, and there is guilty knowledge now. And whilst the service are struggling to get on top of that, the current budget cycle and the SDR is not going to resolve that in a quick enough manner. 3 stations a year when you've got 365 fire stations. That's not going to happen quick enough to actually save the health and well-being of our members. I also hope to be able to speak about response times. Andy Watt, the Deputy Chief Fire Officer, touched on response times being complex. They are complex, and there's a multitude of factors. But if we're going to have to apply mental gymnastics to say that response times are linked to traffic jams, roadworks, traffic calming measures, and not speak about the extended travel time of fewer fire appliances and fewer firefighters having to travel further and further distances, then we're kidding ourselves on and we're not addressing the actual facts. Committee, I look forward to taking your questions and providing evidence today. I appreciate I'm over my 2 minutes there, Convener. I could go on, but I will pause there to allow the committee to come in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot for us to think about in that. I was going to ask you just a little bit about the service delivery review and, you know, what you feel is positive coming from that. But I want to pick up on the reduction in firefighter numbers that you referenced in your opening statement. And I'm interested in just a little bit more, probing a wee bit more into that and looking further into what are the reasons for that happening. So lots of organisations are seeing numbers of staff change due to all sorts of different things, introduction of technology, innovation, AI, less fires in your case. So I wonder if you can just expand a little bit on where these cuts are coming from.
I'll bring John in just a moment, but just to open the thinking around that. So, yes, the single service stripped out a swathe of duplication in the service, and I think the Chief and his team referenced that last when they last gave evidence on the 12th. But what we've seen in our evidence submission, our written submission, you can see the service's own papers. We've taken the graphs from the service to show the year-on-year reduction of whole-time staff. And that 166 in 2023, that was directly correlated to budget. And, Convener, at the moment, we are sitting, I've got the latest statistics here. So they reduced what we call the target operating model. That's the number of firefighters that should be in whole-time positions in order to have our duty system given 24/7 fire cover on every single fire station, on every single fire appliances across Scotland. Currently, we're sitting 103 below the reduced level that was implemented in 2023. That was supposed to resolve that issue. The projected retirements and leavers, and that's a very difficult, that is a complex thing to try and anticipate for a service the size as the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. That's anticipated to be 200 in 2026. The recruit courses that are due to run over that period of time will bring in 144 firefighters. So we're losing another 56 roles because the service can't recruit quick enough to keep up with that attrition. And we put pumps off the run every day, and we reduce specialist teams every day, and we never quite catch up. And I'll pose the question to the committee. If, as the service said, there's around about 200, 300 RDS firefighter posts vacant, so not posts that have been removed, but vacant posts because they can't recruit into these areas, what would happen to the service's budget? Bearing in mind they've already had to come back for over £1 million to cover their primary function in response to wildfires this year. What would happen if every single one of those posts was filled? Because then you're looking at another 200-300 retaining fees, another 200-300 return-out fees, another 200-300 payments for training evenings. That would bankrupt the service right now. So whilst these posts may not be occupied, they're vacant, and the service, in our view, can't afford to fill them. I'll pause and allow John to come in with some more detailed thinking around some of those numbers.
So just very quickly on your question, Audrey, not to repeat any of the points that Colin's already made, there's broadly two areas where there are cuts to firefighter numbers. So it's 1,239 in the year-to-date number of posts that have been lost. That's 16%, and that's since the introduction of the single service in 2013. So that's a really significant number, and we've seen the impact that has on response times, and I'm sure we'll get into that later today. The two driving factors, so for whole-time firefighters, people who do this job, that's a predominant earning. They're available 24/7 and cover the vast majority of fire stations across the Central Belt, up the North East Coast, and our more dense populous areas predominantly. That is purely down to funding, right? There is no confusion here. The resource budget for the service is, in real terms, £84 million less than it was the equivalent of the last year, the legacy services in 2012-2013. The current resource budget is £332 million. So it's a huge amount of money. It's a really significant amount. That is what has led to over 720 whole-time posts being lost since 2013. Really, really significant figures, almost 18% of the total. So that impact's really significant. The other part is in relation to retained firefighters, so firefighters who do this as a secondary job or respond to a pager and predominantly respond in more rural, remote communities, not exclusively. There are socio-economic challenges in terms of depopulation of some of these areas. It makes it difficult for the service to recruit members who fill this duty system. And that isn't just purely down to funding, although remuneration is obviously a really key area in how you recruit and retain these people. So it is more complex and purely about money. But I want to be really, really clear. Any reductions to whole-time firefighters and control operators is exclusively driven by funding.
Okay, thank you. I won't ask a supplementary because I'm going to bring in Katie Clark and then I'll hand over to Liam Kerr because I think you want to come in on this, Katie.
Yes, so, and it's really helpful to get your evidence in terms of extended travel time. Could you also maybe say a little bit more about response times, because that's one of the issues that's been very concerning, the fact that there seems to have been quite considerable increases in response times over recent years. I know that the fire service would say, well, there's a health warning round about response times because the response time is a statistic and it's the first appliance arriving, and sometimes you need 3 appliances before you can do what needs to be done, and you need the right configuration, both of firefighters and equipment. But in terms of response times, how concerned should we be about the fact that we are seeing significant increases in response times, and the predictions are they're going to continue to increase? I don't know if Colin would want to come in on that.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. There's no denying that response times are, on their own, not the only measure we should be looking at. The driving force behind my entire career in the fire service, since my first day as a recruit, was about trying to prevent fires and accidents happening in the first place. That is the community safety part. But as I touched on earlier, when these things do happen, as a firefighter that needs to attend to resolve it. And when we're seeing an instance where, because of the complex and dynamic nature of the wildfires across Scotland this year, that those crews were deployed onto hillsides for protracted periods of time, and we then see 57-minute response times for the first appliance to arrive, and whole streets sometimes getting wiped out because of that. And that's not an exaggeration. It is statistically there, it is evidence, that is in the press. These are all instances that have happened. Then we've got a problem. Now, whilst that is a singular incident, or we're talking maybe 3, 4, 5 of those in Scotland, again, I would ask the committee if it was you in a house fire, or your family member in a ditch in a car awaiting rescue, what is a tolerable increase to that response time? And I don't think there is a tolerable increase. So yes, that's a dynamic situation. Yes, it's complex in nature. But the reality is, we've seen year-on-year increases. Now, there have been comments made in the Chamber previously that this is to do with firefighters' health and safety, where they now don their PPE before getting into an appliance so they can have their seatbelt on for the firefighter safety. Something the FBU pushed for, something the FBU has wholeheartedly supported in its entirety. But something that's been in place for the 17 years that I've been a firefighter. This is not new, and we see year-on-year increases to response times. Traffic calming measures have been used as an excuse for year-on-year response times increasing. They're not new. And what I would say is, on the service's own internal risk ratings, traffic calming measures and roadworks never appear on the board's risk register. So they're clearly not the driving force behind increased response times. We've also seen increased call handling times in our control rooms, which lead to increased response times. Now, when we're reporting that our control rooms are so understaffed that they're running at below critical levels, there's the creep of human error potentially there, with people having to do so much more with fewer and fewer staff, leading to increased response times. And then that increased travel distance. As we take out 10 fire appliances, that may be that first response to an incident. The travel distance is further, so it then seems counterintuitive to remove more firefighters and more fire appliances and have further and further travel distances to what would be routine incidents. And that, for us, is one of the main drivers for increased response times. I don't know if John's got additional comment on that.
Yeah, just very quickly, look, I think response times are a really important subject matter. And Colin's covered really accurately. There's a whole range of metrics that are important to measure how the Fire and Rescue Service is performing. And our members have done excellent work to increase preventive work and see a reduction in all incident or many incident types as a result of that. But to be really clear, there is no more effective measure of how resilient a fire and rescue and emergency response we have to the emergency aspect of what our members do than response times. Like, seconds count. And for the ability for our members to make life-saving interventions is absolutely critical. And what should really concern, from our perspective, the committee and the direction of travel of Fire and Rescue Services, every year we see response times increase. Right? The pattern for the last 10 years is consistently, year on year, they are increasing. Is that a position that we're comfortable with? A 90-second increase in response times is really significant over a 10-year period. The other point on this, and Katie touched on this in our question, all we're measuring within this is the response times of the first appliance. At many incidents, what one appliance can do in terms of making meaningful interventions is limited, and in some instance types is non-existent. So we're not even on that one limited area of data, which is useful nonetheless. Often, in many incident types, the real measure is when you can get a second and third appliance to have the weight of response, particularly in high-rise incidents, more complex incidents, more members of the public. So, look, we wouldn't want to pretend that response times only were a key measure, but there's been too much of a drift across Fire and Rescue Services, across the whole of the UK, in moving away from response times. The reason often politicians and chief fire officers are so keen to move away from this metric is the direction of travel has been consistent for 20 years. The reality is, if you're sitting in a house fire or trapped in a car upside down a road traffic incident, response times are absolutely critical to you, and our members recognise that.
Would it be okay if I asked a question about decontamination and to what extent it's covered in the review?
I'll maybe come back to you,
fine.
Katie, on that. That's not a problem, but I'm going to just pass over to just keep my order of questions in my head. So I'll bring in Liam Kerr and then Jamie Hepburn.
Thanks, Kavina. Good morning, panel. It's a not unrelated point, actually, which I'll put to Colin Brown first of all. So when this committee heard from the SFRS about the service delivery review, the SFRS were very clear that the delivery review and the decisions were not driven by budgetary concerns. Now, your written submission disagrees with that. And on that basis, do you conclude that if different budgetary decisions had been taken by the Scottish Government in terms of funding, would that have led to the service delivery review being different in its conclusions? And if so, how?
It's an excellent point. Yes, we believe it would be different, because when we talk about that potential £900 million by 27-28 being removed from the service, had the service had that reinvested, they wouldn't be having to look at ways of freeing up resource and capital budgets from their current funding levels to implement some of the projects. I know Katie had very briefly touched on the decon stuff. The service are looking to modernise their estate to have decon compliant and dignified facilities, but they're not getting the level of capital funding to be able to do that in a timely manner to actually affect that level of change across the entire estate. So I think that is a primary driver there, where they're having to find current capital from within their system to be able to implement massive capital projects. When we look at some of the stations that exist right now, there's health and safety improvement notices that were applied earlier this year that I touched on. The service are having to find ways to resolve that from their current budget. Now, that's fiscal responsibility in a lot of ways, and I know the government and politicians absolutely focus on that quite rightly, and for a taxpayer-funded organisation, they should be looking at how they spend their money. But when we're talking about changing a fire station from having sleeping accommodation for firefitters to be on call from that location and available at a second's notice, and changing that to a building that doesn't require to have that, then we're saving millions of pounds every single time we do that. Now, the service want to reinvest that money back in the service, but our question would be, well, would that genuinely be the decision that they've been making? Would that genuinely be the consideration if that £900 million, or even a third of that £900 million, would have been reinvested back into the service? So our view is that that constant stripping away of both capital and resource has led a situation where the service are having to say, well, how do we replace 14 rack panel construction stations from our current resource, or our current capital budget, sorry.
Thank you. That's clear to me. A very brief supplementary, since we're talking about stations and the estate then. The delivery review proposes to close 8 stations, but which are, I think they're actually described as long-term dormant. 6 of them have been non-operational since before 2016. 5 of them are not staffed. Do you agree with that proposal? Is that one that you're comfortable with, given that situation?
This is, in theory, a challenging question for a trade union that's there to represent firefighters and protect their jobs to answer. And we take very, very seriously our members' responsibilities towards their local communities. The reality is there's not been a fire station or a firefighter in these stations for upwards of 10 years now. So what are we actually protecting? And the reality is that these stations are long-term dormant. They're overwhelmingly volunteer system stations, and we have concerns around that model for a professional fire and rescue service as it is. But that touches on the elements that I said before. Over-reliance on a model that is already causing us to look to close 9 stations, and an increased reliance on a model that is already looking to close 9 stations should be of concern to us, because as the population and societal shifts away from local community, what people living and working in the local community, to that economic drag into large city centres, then we see remote rural communities left without people to staff our VDS stations. In the situation of some of these stations, they're on very small island communities. I think Carrera is and apologies to the residents of Carrera, I think there's a population of around 60, and the age dynamic is the upper percentile generally. So none of them want to be RDS firefighters. And for us, you don't create a crew from zero. So these stations will never be operational again, even with the best will in the world, because it takes 3 years to train a competent firefighter. You need 2 of them to make a BA team. It takes an additional minimum year to get a crew commander in place, an additional year or so to get a watch command team in place. And you can see that generating that experiential learning and that exposure to fire incidents, when they've not had incidents or turnouts for 15 years, these crews will never exist again. So it is entirely sensible for the service to look to shut these stations, because currently they're spending, I would guess, upwards of £1 million a year for appliances, equipment, maintenance, testing, for a station that is absolutely not functioning.
I understand.
I don't know if John has additional comment on that. Sorry.
I mean, just very quickly, and it slightly gets into the point Audrey Nicholl sort of came back to me on in terms of the breakdown and some of the root causes. And it touches on your first question, Liam, and I'll try and be really quick. The FBU is fully supportive of the service, looking at what resources it has and what place. The Firestorm report made clear that there's areas that need to change in the service. And Colin's really clearly touched on a number of those. So we're not against change. We're not against looking at these issues. It's having change that's set in a context that's entirely driven by cuts. And I would disagree with the service's position that SDR isn't driven by cuts, although I can understand why they would make that comment. But the reality is the 10 fire appliances that were removed in 2023 form part of the SDR consultation. The service has been crystal clear. Those changes were driven by not having sufficient finances to staff the 166 posts that were required to keep them there. So it's just context to it. Just very, very quickly onto the specific elements. So it's not just the 8 stations, and I appreciate the question, the dormant stations. The other end of the scale, just to exacerbate that point, the second busiest station in Scotland is potentially earmarked for closure within that. Now, some of that touches into issues that go back past the current government, many decades going back in terms of capital infrastructure spend across a range of public services, but particularly in the fire and rescue service. And now we have a legacy where you have an £800 million effectively problem that has to be solved at some point. And some of these areas are wrapped into this. But the went through the context of looking at second busiest station in Scotland in terms of incident responses, pushed into that situation because there hasn't been sufficient capital spend on the actual building itself, part of the options, compared to stations which have been dormant for 6, 7, 8, and in some cases 10-year decade. And one final point, and it's an aspect that we're not going to be able to cover today. I'd be highly surprised if we're going to be able to cover. 3/4 of fire stations in Scotland are staffed by retained or volunteer firefighters. And these are communities where increasingly we're seeing depopulation of the model of people we would expect to join the fire and rescue service. That's a real issue moving forward. And it goes beyond funding that. But we can't lose sight of the fact that many of these changes are specifically driven by the fact that there's such a significant funding gap over the last 12 years.
Okay. Do you want to come back in at all?
Just for the record, which is the second busiest station in Scotland that you were talking about?
Cowcaddens in Glasgow.
Thank you.
Very much. Jamie Hepburn, then Sharon Dowie.
Okay, thank you, Conveners. Colin John, although my own area is potentially impacted by proposed changes to Cumnall Fire Station, not a full closure, I should say, for the public record. I'm very grateful to the FBU for the interaction I've had with them, particularly local members, so I just want to place that on a record. My first question is, I guess, a sort of process question, and just to get your perspective on it. I mean, clearly we have a national service just now. I think there are many advantages derived from that. I've seen that locally in terms of the tremendous response from firefighters across the entirety of central Scotland with wildfire locally, St Mungo's fire, as you'll be well aware of. But I have been struck by the fact, and actually the mention of Cowcaddens is a pertinent point here, that the proposals do seem to have been done almost on a localised, regional basis. So Cumbernauld is part of the proposals that are set out for Lanarkshire, but we, in my area, might just be as impacted by, for example, the closure of Cowcaddens or changes that have been positive for Springburn as well. So I suppose the question inherent within that is, do you think, is that a concern for yourselves as well in terms of the process? We have a national service, but the manner in which these proposals have been laid out doesn't necessarily seem to have reflected that or taken advantage of the fact that we have a national service.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and it's a point. The service referred to having pan-Scotland resources, and that ability to bend and flex to instant types and needs. Wildfires is a perfect example, but also specialist instance, rope rescue instance. There's 4 rope rescue teams across Scotland. That's a crushingly small number when you think of the geography of Scotland and the potential for that type of rescue. So that is the elements, and there's elements where rope rescue teams may have to be moved or reduced, or whatever happens to them is being termed as part of a different part of this review. There is a degree of sympathy for the service, and how do you consult on something that's so broad-reaching? How does somebody in the Isle of Skye, to pull somewhere out of my head, consult on a proposal for the centre of Glasgow? The lived experience and their interaction with the fire service is remarkably different usually. So there is an issue with how do you meaningfully consult that way. But with us now being a pan-Scotland resource, there should be interaction between these two things to say, well, what is the impact? And yes, there is every likelihood that closing a station in location A will impact on stations across the country.
Yeah, maybe it's not so much the process of, when we could talk about the process of consultation and concerns we have, but it's actually maybe the proposals that have been consulted on. Do you feel that that's been given enough consideration in terms of how in one area it might impact in another. I mean, that's a concern for me, for example.
I'll bring John in, but we, in the second document that I think we put forward to the committee as written evidence here, we set that out, and that was the pre-consultation phase with stakeholders. We set out the fact that shouldn't be pitting one against other. And certainly the feedback that we've received from our engagement with communities is, Mary Hill is a striking example where they say, why are we essentially saying we can have a pump back, but only at the cost of the station down the road? And that element of pitting one against the other has been raised as a concern. It's certainly of a concern to us. John, I don't know if you've got additional on that.
Yeah, look, I think I understand the broad principles of the question, and we certainly have come across areas of questioning in terms of some of the rationale behind some of the options. But I think a far greater concern is the whole process is a cart before the horse. The money hasn't been there for years now. So we are sitting 10% below what the current operation model should be for whole-time firefighters sitting in fire stations now, today. These options are largely driven by that. So they are reactive to adapting to the fact that there is 10% of the workforce that should be there to support the resources that are currently sitting in fire stations that isn't there. And that has driven to where we are today. So the fact that this is needing, some of these options are needing to be done quickly, it's all directly interlinked to just resource, either resource in terms of physical resource, but predominantly resource in terms of people. And that's what's driving these issues. So what we're really keen not to happening, and I think I can absolutely understand MSPs focusing on constituents' issues, and I think a lot of that's to be welcomed. But the point is, the step back is, there currently aren't the people in the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service right now to maintain these resources as they are. The reality is, right now, 16 whole-time pumps that are on a bit of paper in August 2023 that provisionally should be there to protect communities don't have the staff, either were removed in September 2023 temporarily from operational duty, or are sitting empty in terms of people and couldn't respond to incidents right now. Now, that isn't a situation that can be maintained. We can't maintain a situation where, on the face of it, we say we have X resources, but in reality, they're not there to respond to the very emergencies that they're designed to reflect it. From that perspective, we welcome SDR, because what the service is doing now and has been doing for many years is completely unsustainable. But it is so critically linked to resource. And if we don't have the resource, you can't have the response. And that's a bit, that high-level bit is the bit we need to see governments outside the Fire and Rescue Service wrestling with. Do we have the correct resource to provide the resilience that in chambers such as these and that we expect that we should have?
I'm not going to get too drawn on Maryhill Fire Station, even though it was the one that was closest to me growing up. And I totally understand the point you're making in terms of you're not going to get too drawn into the one area against the other. But you would accept the point I'm making, though, that if we're going to have a national service, as we do, and all the advantages that exist, if there's service redesign, then the national picture and how area by area interacts with one another should be part of the equation. You would accept that?
Absolutely accept that. What I would say is, just to give a very succinct and brief example, when Storm Arwen swept down the east coast of Scotland a number of years ago, there were entire communities cut off that national resource couldn't access. People's houses who, if there's water ingress into electrics, we regard that as a very significant situation with what we would term as persons reported inside a house that's potentially at risk of significant fire. Completely cut off from resources that could have normally accessed those communities because the road network's either inundated with water or washed out completely. So the idea of a national resource in normal conditions is really important and very effective, but we need to think, are we closing things behind natural barriers that will come through peak times? So that's the challenges that we need to consider alongside all of this.
Just one other area on service redesign. You talked about dignified facilities and Presence Iraq. That's an issue at Cumbernauld. I mean, clearly there are constraints around capital. I mean, for the service, but I just mean generally in terms of for the government as a whole. I mean, to be even handed, you would recognise Scottish Fire and Rescue Service in their delivery review have cited they understand the issues around the need for dignified facilities in Iraq, but more widely in terms of service redesign. The world has changed. You've set out yourselves in terms of Firestorm. The service does perhaps need redesign and thought through it. probably not going to be able to get into too much detail given the time we have, but could you set out sort of some of the high-level points that you think would be required for a review or change to service provision?
Yeah, the reality is, without personalising this against yourself, Jamie, if not your constituency, then whose? And that's always going to be the question. A local community is always going to say, we don't want our fire station at the end of our road closed, moved, taken away, because irrelevant of the industrial risk that was maybe put there to protect not being there anymore, those individuals still live there and they still want their house protected. They still want that community safety engagement, still want that safety blanket that is there from that fire and rescue service and that station being local. So that's always going to be a challenge through these sorts of consultations. And you know, we have spoken really openly about the fact that we want to enter into this with an open hand and actually understand what we're doing here. The mantra of the right people in the right place at the right time, we fully support that. But what I would point out is that on this SDR, there's not a single resource increased in a single community across Scotland, in spite of the change in risk that we continue to reference. Change in wildfire risk, change in flooding risk. In fact, we're actually reducing the coverage provided by water rescue teams, potentially in Hoyk. Water rescue team potentially going to be day crewing only and supported by a retained duty system overnight. We've spoken about the potential issues there. So what we're saying is that, yes, there needs to be a conversation. Yes, there needs to be thought around this. But when there's that financial pressure, that our belief is that that is the driving force behind much of the review, the service looking to free up resource in order to reinvest in themselves, then there's potential for bad decisions to be made. We spoke, the committee spoke earlier about potential for making bad policy. The service have the potential to make bad decisions with the best intentions because the pressure they're under to try and free up capital and resource budgets in order to invest in themselves.
Okay. Just maybe for the record, Convener, notwithstanding my genuine concerns about the situation at Cumbernauld, we should say it's not proposed to close or move away.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Those are my questions. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. Sharon Dowie, then Pauline McNeill.
Thank you. Good morning. Some of the changes will see an increased reliance on duty firefighters. You've highlighted in your written submission the sustained recruitment and retention issues the duty system is facing. Could you set out specifically what your concerns are in terms of staff and public safety should these options be adopted?
I will on this occasion be succinct and pass to John, but to begin with, as we touched on earlier, there's a number of stations earmarked for closure under this review because they've been unable to recruit and retain firefighters for a number of years. We've touched on the fact that 200 of the 345 retained duty system appliances can be unavailable at any time of day or night, simply down to the fact that they don't have crew to staff them and mobilise them because people are working and living differently to when that system was designed. The idea that we're going to suddenly create even more reliance on retained duty system, and again, I want to put on the record that the retained firefighters that work across Scotland and across the system in the UK do phenomenal work with such limited time spent training, such limited time to actually engage in being a firefighter. They are exceptional human beings that we should all commend, and I know the committee do that without having to say so. But there can be no escaping the fact that there are huge gaps. 80% of Scotland's landmass is covered by RDS stations, and 200 of those at times, or 200 of those appliances, are unable to respond to emergency incidents in those communities, unable to provide that community safety engagement, unable to do the work of fire and rescue service. That should be a concern as the service look to review how they do these things, because when we've got 100 firefighters on a hillside at a wildfire, the overwhelming majority of them are retained firefighters who, on sheer earning capacity, are taking a cut from stepping away from their primary employment to be a firefighter for their communities. And that system is hugely problematic in that sense because the attrition rate just keeps churning over. John?
Yeah, so, I mean, there's so much we could say about retained firefighters. I mean, almost an entirely unique public sector worker, certainly emergency public sector worker in Scotland, people who earn the majority of their overall earnings from other employers, but can give up to and over 120 hours availability per week on a pager, having to respond to their local fire station within 5 minutes to provide emergency service response, where within minutes they could be making life-critical interventions for people. So it is an entirely unique model, and one which presents the fact that we have over 200 fire stations that are purely staffed by retained firefighters, really incredible, but also brings its own challenges. In the more rural areas in Scotland, there's no hiding away from the fact that changes in populations, losing young people, people moving to central belt areas for other reasons, it really significantly undermines, for some retained stations, the model that's been there for decades now. And that's a real challenge. It's not just going to be resolved by the Fire and Rescue Service. There's a societal challenge there. So part of the elements that were over 375 retained firefighters have been lost since 2012-2013. The service just can't recruit these people, can't recruit and retain these people. So some of the issues are very different, or certainly in some aspects are different than experienced necessarily in the shortages in the whole time system. What I would say is those issues are going to take more than just the Fire and Rescue Service to resolve. But there has been positive work with the Fire and Rescue Service over the last year. So just at the start of this year, finally, long overdue, we harmonised, standardised retained firefighters' terms and conditions. That's dating back since 2013. It was a really significant piece of work. And we negotiated a significant pay increase for retained firefighters. Now, what I would say is their earnings are still, in many cases, really minimal. And that's one of many, not exclusively, but one of many challenges that's faced there. But it's an area of focus that is significant, and one that, as Colin's touched on already, with retained fire stations making up almost 75% of fire stations in Scotland, it's a really significant area. Just linking in both that question, Sian, and also Jamie's previous question, one potentially real missed area of opportunity within this, and Jamie touched on the areas that the union would welcome in terms of change within the SDR process, or certainly leaning towards that, is considering what firefighters do. So what type of incidents do firefighters respond to? So for a long period of time now, there's been a real recognition that there could be additional value in firefighters responding to types of incidents that currently they're not contractually obliged to do so. Indeed, in 2022, Scottish Fire and Rescue Service and the Fire Brigades Union came to an in-principle agreement about expanding firefighters' roles. And without getting into the detail of that, which is withheld, it would see us responding to, or potentially see our members responding to incident types involving terrorist attacks, emergency medical response, that they currently do not, or it would increase their roles within that. Now, why is that important to the potential footprint for retained firefighters, or that element? Currently, there's a really good resource, over 360 fire stations across Scotland, where that additional response could come from. Again, there's a danger of cart before horse here, where we close some of these resources, and then down the line, potentially the funding becomes available or is allocated in such a way that those resources, you could have had emergency medical response in some local vulnerable communities that currently have a very poor or limited provision from National Health Service, Scottish Ambulance Service, where the fire station does currently have a footprint, which we're potentially at risk of no longer having. Now, that doesn't get around the staffing issues in regard to Liam Kerr's question, which Colin covered. If we don't have people willing to do these roles, or there just aren't people there to do the roles in the first place, whether they're willing or not, that's a different challenge. But yeah, the issues facing the retained service are complex, and some are unique to the service itself.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask you a wee question about colour blinding as well? So SFRS is the only UK service removing firefighters due to colour vision testing. No evidence of risk, poor test quality, and no fallback plan. So is that an issue that you're finding, that people are being taken off the run or whatever because of this new requirement for colour vision?
It's not something that in my role I've become aware of, particularly, but John's clearly got more information on this.
Yeah, so I've directly been involved in this, and I would say no, it's not a concern that the union has. One, the numbers have been very limited, and two, we've been involved and worked with the service in regard to this. I would challenge the fact it's the only service in the UK. I think that's inaccurate. That's just a detail that I don't think is correct. But from our perspective, all of these discussions we've had with the employer have been to do with health and safety, both of the individuals affected and also others at the incidents as well. So we've come up with a practical test with the Fire and Rescue Service in terms of recognising colour coding of key safety critical equipment, and that being a sort of layering of testing, and we've done that through negotiation consultation with the employer. So I'm happy to look at the detail again, but it's not an area where we have concerns.
That's fine. And just also one as well then with older firefighters and the fitness tests, is that a concern either? I've heard reports of the fitness level for younger firefighters being the same as that for older, and maybe if it was changed slightly we would keep more people operational.
This broadly goes right back to 2002, 2003, essentially, and at the time the UK Fire Minister Penny Mordaunt given assurances that the changes to fitness standards and the testing would not negatively impact firefighters' longevity and ability to maintain a career through a full 30, now 40-year career. That's not the reality for firefighters, because the changes to pension and the likes are a driving force behind that. We have to look at this from a health and safety perspective, in the sense that you have to be operationally fit to be able to respond to very, very physically challenging environments. But the reality is that you would have to join the service now at Olympic athlete level of fitness in order to maintain that right through an entire career. John's been more involved in the detail work in Scotland around that, but it is a significant concern that there are not roles for firefighters who don't meet that fitness standard, but have an entire career's worth of experience and knowledge that they could share, that essentially will be retired on medical grounds because they can't meet that operational standard. So, John.
Look, I'll be really quick on this because it doesn't directly relate into SDR, but in blunt, the FBU's position in Scotland is that the certainly VO2 max fitness testing level should be higher than the service currently has in place. Now, that isn't to say we would fully expect the employer to support our members who don't meet that level, to meet it through support, assessment, everything else. But look, at the hard end of this, firefighting is a really physically arduous task, and the safety levels linked to that are absolutely critical. And you have a level of responsibility in terms of your own safety, not only to your own safety, but to those that are entirely dependent upon your ability to perform the tasks in that risk-critical environment. So the Fire Brigades Union position, and has been for a long time with Scottish Fire and Rescue Services, we should use a VO2 max of 42.7, not getting into too specific detail. The service choose to monitor people's fitness at that level, but we keep them available and instead have a slightly lower level. Union recognises that, but we don't have concerns in terms of the service putting people off the run or challenges around fitness. If anything, our position would be they should be more stringent on that.
Final question. It was actually kind of covered really by Katie Clark earlier, but I've got a big interest in the increase in response times. So in your opinion, will any increase in response times for any appliance for some areas ever be acceptable? And I was actually, because I was reading through your MSP briefing note for autumn 2025, and you've actually put in it in a contribution, the Minister made a number of statements which at best were misinformed and at worst consciously untrue, and you did make a couple of comments in there about the response that was made on response times. So I was just wondering about if you had any other comments on that.
Yeah, I'll bring John again in a moment. The FBU are always open to anyone approaching us for comment, for background information, for a balance against what we would term as a managerial brief provided by the service, because that's where we actually get genuine progressive or thought-through decisions made. As I touched on earlier, the idea that response times are in some way impacted by something that's been in place for 17 years, more than 17 years, that being the donning of your PPE before getting onto a fire appliance, is, as was said in the briefing, either, as far as we're concerned, demonstrably untrue, because the year-on-year increases are not impacted by that. So there's something else driving that. We've set out very clearly our thoughts on that being directly linked to the reduction in firefighters and the reduction in spread and increased travel times. There is a direct link to changes in incident types. We have been very successful in driving down domestic dwelling fires, which would happen in the local communities that fire stations are based. But we see increase in other incident types like wildfire, so there is an increased travel distance to that type of incident. But ultimately, it all still comes down to, if we've not got that number of firefighters to respond to the same geographical area, the travel distance are going to be great, and therefore the time to get there is going to be greater. John?
There was actually a press release in that area that had said that there was an increase in domestic fires. So I know that we've got a lot of comments that the number of fires are reducing, and it was actually put out by the Minister for Community Safety, who is in my area. Just
before John comes in, there is always a peak and trough. There's, one incident can completely change that dynamic from if we've got 0 and we have 1, then with a 100% increase. So that dynamic can change rapidly. However, it stresses the point that that dynamic nature of how people live and work is the key factor here, and that's where we say, look, you can't run an emergency service simply on counting the pounds and pence. Society has to decide whether they actually want an emergency service, whether they want a health service, whether they want to fund these things and have that adequate insurance policy that we should be, or not? And lastly, before John does come back in, that increase, we would say that if there's fewer firefighters in those communities, and we're seeing an increase in the incident types, there's probably fewer firefighters delivering that community safety message to avoid those incidents happening in the first place. And that, again, is a driver for incident types sometimes peaking and troughing, because that engagement is restricted by the numbers of firefighters delivering it.
Yeah, I think Colin's covered really well the area in terms of we are seeing increases in some incident types. It's a much more complex picture than just saying incident types as a whole are reducing. But I'll not return to that. Look, I think in regard to response times, I think any increase in response time should be unacceptable to all of us. In saying that, though, the qualification I would give is that in some local communities, with the current model we have, increasing response times are inevitable. If we don't have people in really remote rural communities who are either able to or willing to carry out the role of firefighters, we will inevitably see these resources close. And there are wider challenges there in regard to reducing that. The overall process for response times, though, look, ultimately, and we touched on this before, there wouldn't be a fire and rescue service at all if there wasn't an emergency response to life-critical incidents. The organisation wouldn't be there. Now, that doesn't mean all the other areas of work, Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, firefighters, control operators, and all of our members carry out aren't absolutely critical. They are critical. But it's the emergency response that is the absolute foundation of the organisation. That's linked to making meaningful interventions. It's linked to saving people's lives, saving property and reducing risk. And response times are absolutely pivotal to that. So in summary, I would say increasing response time shouldn't be acceptable to any of us. It isn't as blunt as that because there are some communities, because of other societal issues, that it's very difficult to challenge that. However, it is a metric which can measure the fire and rescue service like no other in terms of emergency response.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, Pauline McNeill, followed by Katie Clark.
Good morning. I want to explore for a minute how we got here. I'm familiar with centralisation. I know you supported it. We didn't think probably we'd be here in 2025 telling us there's almost £1 billion, because that was not the point of the exercise, was to make all these cuts. I want to just highlight, so this is where I'm interested to explore, because so we heard from the management team at Fire and Rescue. They were at least clear that they needed a certain amount of money, otherwise they would have to reduce the headcount. So in that sense, the union and the management are saying the same thing. They might disagree with the figures. I would say it's the starkest warning I've ever seen from Justice Partners. The police are saying the same as you're saying. You went along with the centralisation, you made the efficiency savings, and now you're coming to the committee and you're telling us that this is going to impact on the people that we represent. So I think it's the most serious situation I recall as an elected member. You said in page 24 of your submission, and I'm sure you'll know this off by heart, but in 2024 you said there was sustained underfunding forced the SFRS to temporarily withdraw 10 frontline fire appliances and reduce operational headcount by 166 firefighter posts in September 2023. So this was temporary, but you predicted that it would be permanent. And you go on to say, yes, you were right, the inclusion of permanent solutions in 20 is evidence that FBU's concerns were well founded. So I just thought, rather than go over the whole of 13 years, why don't we start here? And I suppose my question is then, that is, I don't know if you think there's another example in time that would be better illustrate where these cuts have started to happen, the big cuts, if you like. What has the minister responsible been saying to you? Presumably, you've met with her and you've discussed this with her. I mean, could you share that with the committee?
Yeah, and I think I'd start by actually commenting on the Chief's comments a couple of weeks back. I don't think it's lost on firefighters, probably across the entire UK, that for generations now, probably since the response time targets were removed a number of years back, chief fire officers overwhelmingly have gone along with the idea of cut our budget and we'll make it work. Reduce our headcount, we can make it work. And now and this may be because of the political shifts that have happened at a UK level. That's not for me to comment on in this sphere. There is a step change in how the National Fire Chiefs Council, that is their body, are now engaging in the conversation around budgets. And they are now saying we've gone too far, too fast and too deep. And they now need to reverse that funding situation. That's echoed across the entire UK Fire and Rescue Service. But for us, the spotlight obviously being in Scotland, I think we should commend our Chief Fire Officer and go on the record to say, I'm incredibly pleased to see a Chief Fire Officer for Scotland come to this committee and say, we are on a precipice right now. And when we spoke earlier about whether we're in crisis or not, we're on the precipice of a crisis, whilst there may be disagreement between us about the direct situation now. I think the Chief set out very succinctly that we're right on the point of being in crisis, because the numbers that would have to be cut, the previous Chief spoke about potentially 700 firefighter posts at a flat cash budget when the resource spending review was implemented. We're back in that situation because whilst the budget and this committee, again, commend the committee for their work over recent years to influence the budget setting for Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, that it wasn't flat. It's not kept pace with inflation and the costs. So there is that key point. So there's been attrition from the service, just that slow creep of headcount out, and as John touched on, we're about 139. That was 1,239, sorry, below where we started in 2013. But that key point of 166 at the stroke of a pen, just being written out of our target operating model as just a reduction in headcount, that is a key point. And overwhelmingly, and I had the task, let's call it that, of working through the parliamentary record from Scotland. And the Minister overwhelmingly responds to any written or oral question regarding Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, the changes being proposed, and else, as these are operational decisions for the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. Now, there's a space in between these two places, but we would not want politicians directly interfering in the day-to-day running of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. That is clear. It should be a semi-autonomous board under that governance structure. But what we'd also say is there cannot just be a complete washing of any responsibility for that oversight of such significant decisions that are generational for the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, the biggest change since the single service was created in 2013. But these are generational impacts that potentially remove firefighters, fire stations, fire appliances from communities across Scotland. And that should be something that there's political oversight. We've called for it. We called for it in the Chamber. I know Katie Clark took a members' debate specifically on that didn't go the way we would have liked to have seen it. Now, that's just the mechanisms of Parliament. But there should be this oversight and greater levels of oversight against such significant decisions. It shouldn't be on an unelected, appointed board to make decisions that impact every single person living and working in Scotland today.
Just really, really quickly on that point. So what has led us to where we are today? Well, there's a couple of aspects. I'll be really quick. So on the resource funding aspect, I think Collins covered it really well, and the service has in cumulative terms saved 750 million, we calculate. To date, they project by 27-28 it'll be 900 million. Originally, it was outlined to be just over 330 million. So from a resource perspective, our position would be the service just hasn't been provided with the resources it needs year on year. Certainly since the introduction of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, I would argue it predates that quite significantly. Colin touched on really well in terms of the challenges facing the service up here aren't unique. In fact, if anything, they're exacerbated more so in some fire and rescue services south of the border from a funding perspective. But then from a capital budget allocation perspective, this goes back decades. You don't build up an £800 million capital backlog for a service that would a £47 million capital budget in a matter of years. This is decades of a problem. And again, in terms of governance, in terms of the role of the Minister, in terms of the role of the Parliament, what do our members expect? Our members don't expect the Parliament to be being involved in individual operational decisions. What they expect is making grown-up decisions in direct correlation to do with what do we want firefighters to do? What do we want firefighters to do over the next 10 to 15 to 20 years? What do we want them to provide for the communities of Scotland? And are we matching resource to our ask? And if we're not marrying up these two things, we're asking an organisation to
that's
fail.
what, John, that's why I'm asking you the question. Yeah. I would have thought that this, what I've highlighted 23 and these temporary I mean, I'm just asking, did you have that discussion? I mean, I agree with everything you've said. There's an operational board and it's not for politicians to interfere in the running of the service, but the resource is the responsibility of the Scottish Government. I would have thought that would be a good place to start, question the Government and the resource they're allocated, because now we're here in 25 and we don't know what the January budget will bring for the fire service. So I just wondered if...
So we've been clear with the Minister on every occasion that we've met her and previous ministers that the service is underfunded, it's critically underfunded, and that has a direct impact on response. So those 10 appliances that were withdrawn in 2023, and Colin's correct to touch on, that's 166 posts on paper that were removed. These 166 posts were already vacant, and they were vacant because of underfunding. So it's a point that comes up in every engagement we have with the Minister, and probably in all levels politically.
What response are you getting to that?
So, having asked directly, what's the roadmap to reverse the temporary withdrawal and the temporary reduction? Because, like I said earlier, 3 years to train a competent firefighter. What's the mechanism, what's the roadmap to reverse that temporary cut? Blank. Blank expressions. Everyone looks at their shoes because they know it's not going to happen. They know it wasn't temporary. What was temporary was the fact that there wasn't a direct public consultation for such significant removals. And they knew they had to bring that back, which is now incorporated within the SDR process we had to speak about today.
Okay, so just lastly, I mean, there's many implications which you've talked about, but you did mention at the beginning the wider role of the Fire and Rescue Service, and sometimes we don't talk enough about the role that you have if there's an accident in the AME or somewhere, and you know, critical job to save someone's life here. I mean, I'm not going to go into my concerns about shutting Cowcaddens or Yorkhill, because that's the region I represent. But I'm thinking of Cowcaddens as a good example, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm assuming that the location of a fire service station like Cowcaddens being so close to a big motorway is critical in response times for accidents, serious accidents on the M8. Or is that not the case?
This betrays...
Plead for just a single response, because we are short of time. I've still got a couple of members to come in, so if you would...
Absolutely. I did say at the start that John and I are probably the wrong people to ask to be succinct, but this betrays some of the issues with the entire consultation process. So, on the one hand, we've got the service consultation saying Cowcaddens, it's not a significant change, still able to put the right people in the right place at the right time. But as you said, it's ideally located to respond to these types of incidents. On the other part of the consultation process, we have Balmossy and Dundee that has said it's not near enough the road network to be able to respond efficiently to incidents, and not near enough population basis to be of significant impact. It's also a station that's co-located with ambulance service, which is a primary driver of public sector reform, that they're looking potentially to shut as one of these options. So these two statements from the service within their consultation seem to be contradictory. One's not close enough to the network, and we talk about response times impacted by that.
In your view, Colin, just sorry to be clear, in your view though, as a firefighter, is the location of these stations important for the response time in relation to getting to major road networks? I know it's not just always major road networks, but... Absolutely.
It comes back to response times. The quicker we can get firefighters there, that golden hour of intervention and then taken to clinical care, that golden hour starts the minute the accident happens. So the sooner we can get people on scene, the better.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Katie Clark, then Fulton McGregor.
Thank you. And we're obviously primarily looking at the review, but we're also looking at the budget, and the two, it's very difficult to disentangle some of the issues. And I hear what you're saying, that your concern is that some of the proposals are primarily driven by a cuts agenda. I asked earlier about decontamination, because it seems to me, I mean, you've set out quite clearly the challenge we've got in terms of response times, numbers of firefighters, numbers of appliances. But in committee sessions earlier in this Parliament, we heard very, very strong evidence in relation to decontamination. The fire service as an employer obviously has a duty of care towards its workforce. It's got to provide safe systems of work. It seems clear that that's not been happening. I know you've done a lot of work on this, and the service has relied quite heavily on your work. To what extent is that massive challenge incorporated in this review? Because surely that must feed into some of these decisions. And it'd just be interesting to get your perspective in terms of whether this review really captures that. I'll come to Colin.
It does and doesn't. So I know that's not the answer you're looking for. But I have to commend the service. When the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service do things, they tend to do them well. Obviously, our view on the SDR process is slightly different to that statement. However, the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service were very early adopters of the FBU's decon work. They were very early at getting involved. There are still challenges in other UK Fire and Rescue Services where they don't want to believe the data, they choose to ignore it. So, without getting into the roots on that, the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service approached the Scottish Government and developed it under the CivTech programme, a challenge around how we monitor firefighters' exposure. And that work is ongoing with trials due to start, I believe, very, very soon. So absolutely commend them for their uptake and their response to decon. But again, the challenges around capital and resource, we can't replace stations, we can't redesign stations to have that zoned flow of exposure within a fire station quickly enough at the rate that's required to implement this as fast as possible, in spite of the service's best intentions. So I do commend the service for their work around this and uptake. The review does, any time we put a new build in place or any time we refresh a station, they are implementing all these measures within that. But again, 356 workplaces that need that done now. It's not happening quick enough.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and finally, Fulton McGregor. A brief question, if you wouldn't mind, Fulton.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel. Apologies to the panel and all committee members for not being there in person. I'm still struggling a bit with this cold. Just like Jamie Hepburn, I've had some contact from local fire officers as well, and I want to put on record my thanks to them for coming forward with me on this. And it's a lot of the things that they had raised with me has actually already been covered today by other members. But I wanted to ask us a wee bit about the consultation for the review itself. I wanted to ask your views on that. Some of the criticism that I've heard about the review was that that it wasn't clear and concise enough for people to complete what the actual implications of the changes might be, and that also that there was not a great level of engagement with local organisations, businesses, community groups, this sort of thing, and a lot of the actual publicity of it was put through the SFRS Facebook and social media channels. I'm just wondering if you've got any comments on those thoughts or criticisms, if you like, that have been put to me. Thanks.
Yeah, again, I'll look to be very brief. We've submitted a Freedom of Information request to the service, and the response was that the engagement within the consultation, i.e. response to the survey by letter and by email and by petition format, amounted to 5,726 for the entire consultation across Scotland. Of that, 2,665 survey responses opposed the proposals. There's a further breakdown that I will not go into detail here due to time. There was only 686 expressed support for one or other of the options. The criticism we lodged very early on was that there was no status quo option. Now, we've spoken in Firestorm about status quo potentially not being the best option when we look at the review. However, for the public to have either do you want the station next to you or the station along the road from you shut, and no option to go or none of these, then that was the starting point where we had issues. So there have been issues that have been raised through the consultation. I think the level of engagement, notwithstanding the challenges that an organisation the size of the Scottish Service have in gaining that level of community engagement with such a complex issue, that's been challenging. They have run a number of community engagement sessions. The FBU ran our own engagement sessions that were very well attended. We deliberately kept our people out of the services ones because we felt they should have the space to engage without our influence in the conversation, and we could pick that up with members of the community and community councillors outside that. But I do recognise the challenges the service would have had with this level of engagement being required, but there has been significant criticism about some of the process and some of the way that was conducted. But I would put that on the service to pick up rather than the FBU, to be honest.
Thank you. Fulton, do you want to come back in, or are you happy with that? I don't know if you were able to hear me. I was just asking if you want to come back in,
yeah.
or are you happy with that response?
Yeah, that's it now, convener. I've been unmuted. Thanks very much. No, I'm happy enough with that. I just wanted maybe just a point of clarity that I was asking the question as has been put to me. I wasn't saying that it was for the FBU to take that forward, but I think you answered that, Colin. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much. We are over time. I'm sure we could stay here for another good while and have a further discussion. But in the meantime, thank you very much for coming along today. I think that's been helpful for everyone. So we will now move into private session. Thank you.